but I can assure you it's not on my end. I've seen instructors use polls before. Nicholas, I can use polls too. This was just quick and dirty. I didn't have to type a question. I could just ask and get people to say yes or no. So that's why I didn't use a poll. Yeah, when you have multiple choices with each choice having several words to a sentence, then I think it's more beneficial to go ahead and use more detailed polls. But thank you. It's definitely a reasonable idea. All right. So couple of things there were I want to address before we start class. We don't have everybody yet, so we'll wait for a couple more minutes and then we'll address those issues. Well, we are at 9 o'clock, so I will get started because despite best efforts, we still have some content from yesterday left to cover today. It's not the end of the world, but it's good to stay on task. Now, the first thing is today's movie, Something's Gotta Give, is 2 hours, so we will not be able to meet at 3 or movie. Well, we can have a shorter lunch break. So let's still plan on meeting at 3 because there's nothing stopping you from having your lunch while watching the movie. All right, so let's still plan to meet at 3. So we're taking a little bit of time away from your lunch break, and it's going towards your movie, so you can always grab your lunch and watch the movie at the same time. So we'll go ahead and do that. So we're meeting at 3. The second thing is there was some confusion regarding the presentation, and I will admit my part to it, to not specifying which group does what. I don't think there's a confusion for 3 of the 4 groups, but one group was accidentally misled, and they also chose some members of that group have chosen widowhood and they've prepared for it already. So I'm going to let them present on that. So, you know, if there's any confusion, so we were talking about the group with Erica, Jenna, Susanette, Kendra, and Cassandra. I think that group was had started considering widowerhood, and a few of the students have prepared in that group with the topic, so they're going to get to present that topic independent of the group that's working on it as well. I don't know about the other 2 members in the group, whether they want to also proceed with widowerhood or if they want to work with, what's that? With caring and so on. So it's, you know what, because I wasn't specific enough, you'll be marked in your presentation. Don't put too much thought into, hey, somebody else is also going to present this. Don't worry about it. You'll be judged on your own understanding and interpretation of the content and presentation. So if you have any questions, this is the time to ask before we get started with the lecture. Okay, seeing no questions, let's get started. Oh, we have something in the chat window. Suzanne, admit. We're all going to do, Jenna says we're all going to do widowerhood. Yeah, that's fine. That way none of us are left on our own. Okay, yeah, fine. Nicholas asks, outside sources necessary. Nicholas, no. I mean, there's enough content in your textbook for you to read, think about, and interpret, and you have only 7 minutes. So a max of 7 when you have to stop. And I'm going to stop the presentation for people. I'm going to tell them your 5 minutes are up, and then you have 2 minutes to wrap up. But either way, you have to finish in 7 minutes because we're not going to get everybody in otherwise. So let's don't worry too much. If you are feeling super adventurous, go for it. But I'm not going to insist. All right, let's get this going. Oh, there we go. So we spoke about how Parkinson's disease is a constant reminder of vulnerability, and we had some quotes from interview respondents, and we spoke about a snapshot of PD and PD treatment, and the connection of Parkinson's disease and never-aging masculinities. The other challenge, similar to men's slow awareness that their Parkinson's disease motor symptoms signal a progressive disease and there are disabilities, and it challenges their masculinity practices. Aging men's experiences of prostate or male breast cancer they don't commonly arouse a decision to go visit a physician or worry about their disease being disabling. Both of these cancers have symptoms that can initially be trivialized, and because the symptoms are less discerning, they're not troubling, but they're both quite nasty cancers. They grow slowly without symptoms. They're kind of a quiet asymptomatic cancer, but they're going to have ongoing repercussions for men's lives. Their treatments typically are body altering, and they change masculine subjectivity. Of course, one difference is that prostate cancer is pretty much expected. You're over 45, 50, it's recommended that men go in for an annual or at least a biannual prostate exam. It typically accounts for 1/5 of all cancer diagnosis in men in North America. And it's the second leading cause of cancer deaths among men. That being said, it's the second leading cause of deaths because it is that prevalent, but the prognosis is generally pretty good. The 5-year survival rate for newly diagnosed prostate cancer is approaching 99%, which means if you are diagnosed with prostate cancer, there's a 99% chance that you will make it past the 5-year mark if you're treated. Male breast cancer is very rare. It accounts for about 1%, 1 in 100 men that have cancer will actually get it. So the odds are actually pretty low. And 1 in 1,000 men with male breast cancer will actually die. Long-term, for either prostate cancer or breast cancer, post-treatment, men live quite normal lives. Of course, that doesn't mean that the reaction to a diagnosis of either cancer is taken very well. The impact of both types of cancer in the past 2 decades, it affects men's subjectivities, and researchers are getting interested in looking at how men interpret these 2 cancers. Typically, either cancer, they both considered gendered cancers because breast cancer is typically associated with females. So it is kind of gendered in that way. So it's contrary to its gendered location that it's seen in men as well. Prostate cancer is gendered because women don't have a prostate. men narrate the experience of getting either cancer, typically with shock. So, you got to be kidding me, and that kind of stuff. Um, there's an example of an older gentleman, Henry. He's 82 years old. He was diagnosed with breast cancer. And of course, his immediate response is, you just don't expect this to happen. As far as I knew, men didn't get this thing. Breast cancer in men who think they only have chest that's not accurate. Men diagnosed with prostate cancer, even though they know it's possible, they still have a profound sense of having the floor disappear underneath them when they hear the diagnosis. So the author starts by talking about prostate cancer. Typically, early stage prostate cancer is asymptomatic, and it's experienced as having minor genitourinary trouble. So you have difficulty urinating, you feel the urge to urinate, but you can't go. There might be issues getting an erection, etc. Typically, what men like to do at this stage is they like to be watchful and wait. They prefer radiation and surgery. Now, if prostate cancer remains in situ, means at the same location, then typically the medical advice also says wait and watch. Once obviously the physician starts to get concerned about tumor size, then there are different methods. In the old days, you didn't have endoscopic procedures where they'd stick a tube in and have a camera attached to it. You could go in through a very small opening, go and remove the tumor. But these days, it's possible to do a laparoscopic method where you go and it's called a keyhole surgery. You just go in and remove the prostate and surrounding tissue. And typically, this is followed by androgen deprivation therapy. Androgen deprivation therapy is basically you temporarily shut down testosterone. And the reason you do that is both testosterone and estrogen in women are they promote cell division and cell growth. And when you have cancers, it's a good idea to shut them down, at least temporarily. So following the removal of tumor, there's an androgen deprivation therapy, especially when the cancer is rapidly advancing. Now, it basically will slow down the growth, but it can cause chemical castration for men, so that there's a loss of libido. And androgen suppression can result in the development of breast tissue as well. Men can experience things like hot flashes, and it can interfere with sexual performance as well. So one man's comment about the way his treatment-induced impotence affected his wife's quality of sex life and marital relationship is expressed as, my wife and I have talked about it. And when I mentioned it to her that I thought I had an erection, she said, well, what do you mean thought? Was it a dream or did it really happen? Do you know? Well, I said, I didn't go like fully. And she said, well, next time that happens, let me know. Now, there are different ethnic perspectives following treatment. In a study of Latino and African American men, 50 to 70 in LA, undergoing prostate cancer treatment, the major challenges that were discussed were not exclusively body-centered, but they were related to work and control and independence. And that's because that was their masculinity script. For the Latino and African American men, incontinence proved to be a primary threat. That's a post-operative impact, and also incontinence could be a result of chemotherapy and androgen suppression as well. So for them, the incontinence was a big threat to their ability to work. Work and the ability to work were an integral part of how men viewed themselves as men. And from personal experience, a lot of men, personal as in familial experience, a lot of men undergoing prostate surgery, often because of incontinence, feel emasculated, and they're not willing to wear a diaper and go to work. That isn't simply seen as an option. Many white prostate cancer survivors were already retired when they were diagnosed, yet their cancer caused a lot of troubles, from them feeling less of a man because his body wasn't the same, and struggling with impotence. Um, and so they really had to renegotiate their masculinity ideologies as they continued to age. Now, there's an example of a gentleman who's named as Pierre in his late 50s who elected to go for surgery, and he struggled with incontinence and impotency. Um, so he was able to reframe his masculinity, saying, I can deal with the impotence because I can love my kids, I can love my wife, I can socialize, I can flirt. Impotence isn't stopping me. Incontinence in his situation was more troubling. So to endure that, what Pierre did, as per the author, is he disrupted the invisibility of a man with prostate cancer by his decision to participate in a men's cancer support group, which helped him feel one in a group, and he didn't have to go it alone. So he felt, as he. So from his perspective, his participation began a quest for new fulfillments in later life. So, picking up on the quest narrative, that's how he chose to redefine his masculinity. Now, unfortunately, in public and professional discourse, prostate cancer is always discussed heteronormatively, which means in the context of heterosexual men. Now, even though there's a lot of medicine and researchers have tried to understand how race, ethnicity, marital status, and socioeconomic status might structure the prostate cancer experience, there's hardly any work done on the impact of dealing with prostate cancer and the gender identity or sexuality. How middle-aged and old gay and bisexual men are likely to be affected differently in the major areas of impact, right from sexuality to social relations to relations in the medical community. It's not understood properly at all. Now, trans women can also develop prostate cancer, and that's rarely been reported. It's not been studied. Among heterosexuals, what needs to be understood more is the discourse that prostate cancer essentially will demasculate men. So it's, instead of thinking about it as creating an opportunity to reformulate their masculinity script. So men have many different aging and prostate health trajectories that have been theorized that threaten their performance of whatever form of never aging masculinity they previously embodied. But most of these threats tend to be short-lived, and men's habitus is flexible, it's malleable, and they continue to live as men. I mean, they just modify it and go along. But the discourse seems to suggest that it's hugely problematic. So typically, each man living with cancer is challenged to manage an illness, disrupted embodied masculinity, and he's challenging the never-aging masculinity script. In case of male breast cancer, there are many similarities in terms of the change of life to prostate cancer, even though impotence and incontinence might not be an issue. Again, there's a limited amount of research that looks at men's experience with their breast cancer, despite their experiences, and it's quite compelling stories about having breast cancer and then dealing with their masculinity. Typically, breast cancer in males is invasive ductal carcinoma. So we all have lacteal ducts, whether you're male or female. There might not be breast tissue, but lacteal ducts exist. So those ducts can develop cancer. It usually presents as a painless lump, and it's clinically managed in ways identical to women. There's mammography, removal of the tissue. There's fine needle biopsy, by which they take a look at the tumor, mastectomy, and sometimes chemotherapy, and 5 years of estrogen blocking hormonal therapy. So there's a drug called tamoxifen, and tamoxifen is supplied, and that's how you keep it suppressed. However, as we spoke, it's really, really rare to have male breast cancer. So that could be part of the reason why you don't have many anecdotal or many narratives and research on men's experiences with breast cancer. Um, the general public is also not familiar with the concept that men too have breasts. Men commonly delay seeking a medical opinion. By the time they actually go in for a diagnosis, the tumor can be the size of a half of a ping pong ball. So it's a pretty big tumor at that point. There's no watchful waiting with this disease. It's not like prostate cancer, which is very well understood that it's a slow-moving cancer. With male breast cancer, it's immediate surgery, and typically there's a radical mastectomy because of the tumor size and the removal of the surrounding tissue and lymph nodes. The idea is to get the cancer before it hits the lymph nodes, because then it metastasizes pretty fast. So what happens as a result of the surgery is it does affect men functionally, because a lot of muscle tissue is also removed. So, doing things like being able to lift objects over your head or rotate your shoulder or throw a ball can become challenging or even impossible. So following treatment for breast cancer, there are a lot of distressing side effects. Men may feel odd with the mastectomy scar, uh, but most men get comfortable with their disfigured chest. Uh, there's an example of a man, Patrick, who uses a food metaphor to comment on his post-surgical chest and the loss of muscle behind the breast tissue. Says, well, I'm a simple guy. You have a chicken patty, then you go get a chicken nugget as far as muscle. So now I have a chicken nugget. So, he's seeing the lighter side of it. They took out the chicken patty. Another man called Jeff, he comments, I was kind of self-conscious the first year, but it is a sizable scar right down to, the ribs. It doesn't really bother me. I go on vacation or go swimming on the beach. I'm not self-conscious. I don't feel like people are staring at me. I really think a lot of people don't even notice. Obviously, the gold standard of treating breast cancer is anti-estrogen therapy following the mastectomy. However, it can yield nightmarish hot flashes and weight gain. Now, typically, what happens with anti-estrogen therapy is it's not that men produce estrogen, they don't have ovaries, but the idea is to hit the sex hormone precursor. Both testosterone and estrogen have a common precursor, and there's a branch point, and in women, the ovaries end up using, downstream of cholesterol. Cholesterol is a starting point for the making of androgens, um, so for either testosterone or estrogen. But what tamoxifen does as anti-estrogen therapy is it hits it way before that can happen. So even though it's called anti-estrogen therapy, it's total sex hormone suppression. So the issue with that, even though you're a man undergoing anti-estrogen therapy, the impact is hot flashes and weight gain. It also impacts sexual libido and sexual performance for at least a quarter, maybe between a quarter and a half of the men who are undergoing um, estrogen suppression. So initially, they talk about Thompson, which is the author of the textbook. In his 2010 work, he talks about one of the respondent, Kenneth. His response to tamoxifen was, well, forget this. After 2 months, he tried it again for a very brief period, and obviously he didn't like it at all. They speak about another man, Stephen, in his 4th year of therapy, and he was planning to continue it until its conclusion. And he's talking about his journey. And he says, being a man, you think emotions are like following the Oakland Raiders with a beer in your hand. But to be ruled by emotions, I mean, I have PMS, I have hot flashes, I have emotional expressions, I have things where I react, where my emotional reaction is the primary reaction. And that is not a male experience in life. And this is a deviation from the traditional masculinity script for him, so he finds it challenging. So due to the unexpected acquisition of breast cancer, and therefore the supposition that there's a breast. The loss of traditional gender signifiers, sexual function, upper body strength, and range of motion and emotional steadiness. Uh, the men tend to often self-describe more than even others that they have been emasculated. But this interpretation may misunderstand the way most men with breast cancer soon reject any further effort to adhere to the traditional never-aging masculinity. Now, one of the men in the author studies, when he was a former Marine, he was a Golden Gloves boxer, he was a marathoner and landscape businessman whose habitus rapidly transformed as he embodied his cancer. He describes his newfound comfort doing things that would have threatened his earlier securely grounded masculinity subjectively. So what he says is, I definitely can consider myself a more complete human than I was before because I'm able to um, I'm able to feel, It doesn't matter if you're a dude or a girl. It's really unbelievable. As a guy, my age group, a man doesn't cry. A man doesn't show his emotions. It's like you kind of be like a machine, no more. So he's actually quite comfortable with this transformation. Now, of course, he did other things too. So he started uh, also, I would say, argue following a quest narrative where he threw himself into public forums to initiate personal conversations with others about men living with and going through breast cancer. His narrative transformed from abject chaos uh, of the diagnosis and mastectomy into forms of questing to befriend any other man with cancer, to participate in national education programs about breast cancer also affecting men, and also to offer shout outs for cancer care nursing. It's a lack of reporting, and it's also a smaller percentage of the population. But there appears to be very rare incidences of trans women who develop breast cancer. Usually, after many years of hormonal treatment and for maintenance of female secondary sexual characters, um, it's typically not seen very common, and it could be a reporting thing. It could be a consequence of long-term hormonal therapy, so that the trans women can maintain breasts, stuff like that. The etiology of trans women's breast cancer is, that's the correlation. But like cisgender men developing breast cancer, it's mostly guesswork that is the case. Typically, when there are no visible signs of cancer, if you're a cancer patient, you've gone through chemo, you've gone through surgery, uh, people say that individuals are in remission. Remission is different from being cured. And cured is the idea that, well, a cancer from a certain source is with almost 99.9% guarantee not likely to recur. Remission means they can't detect any visible signs. So people in remission, even though they can live their normal lives and are not actively going through chemo, they are in constant monitoring just to make sure they don't get it back again. Um, so given the likelihood that aging men will survive breast and prostate cancer, the remission, the conceptualization of the remission society is applicable. That means where post-treatment men become well enough, but they're not cured. Um, so men in remission with either cancer, they occupy a limited transitional space. And they move on to living with and living through and living beyond cancer, but they never go back to the same space that they inhabited prior to the diagnosis. So, to summarize this chapter gave us a review of some health inequality by race, by class, and by ethnicity. And how it affects health performance. the process of doing health involves many multiple factors, and there are several cultural traditions as to what is a right health practice and what is a wrong health practice. And this is not limited by country. Within a country, it's different ethnic groups that practice one form of health versus another, and they're all incredibly closely tied to masculinity practices of men as well. Okay. All right, with that, we will end lecture 7 or chapter 6. What I'm going to do now is we will take 5 minutes for questions maximum if you have questions, comments, and then we will move on to sexual health. Hey, Brian, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to understand a little further about in terms of treatment after like post treatment, do men kind of transform their masculinity to kind of suit their current condition? Is that what's going on?
Yes, yes. And the transformation is obviously more radical. The more so pre-treatment, the more tightly men that are tied into their masculinity scripts, the more radical the transformation. Um, in general, some men aren't that tied to the typical script anyway, perhaps due to lived circumstances, perhaps due to accommodations they've had to make. So for those men, the transformation of their masculinities is perhaps not that radical. So obviously it varies from person to person, but for a lot of men who have a lot of ties into the traditional masculinity script, it's a radical transformation and accepting all of these different changes.
Right. But does that like has there been cases where the radical transformation have led these men to experience severe depression that possibly may lead them to suicide?
That's a great question. I don't know the stats on this. I don't know. I don't have the data, but that's something I might be able to look up. But what to me is interesting is the men that make the transformation and accept the transformation. They don't tend to be suicidal because they tend to cope with the change that they're being presented with. It's the men that are in conflict. This is again speculation. I'd have to get data to support that. It's the men that are in conflict about their changing role as men that end up going into depression and getting suicidal.
Right. Okay, I get it. Thank
Okay,
you, sir.
no problem, no problem. I don't have any other questions or comments, so we will start with sexual health. So, I mean, it is, I don't think anybody would disagree with it, but all older adults, no matter their gender or sexual orientation, should have the opportunity to enjoy a satisfying and fulfilling sex life. In fact, most of them do, even if interest in sex and sexual activity declines to some extent with increasing age. So in most developed countries in Europe, North America, and Asia, with old men and women living healthier lives, many old people remain sexually active well into their later life, through their 70s and through their 80s. In spite of what one might consider imperfect information that's available, what the author tries to do in this chapter and what I'll try to do in this lecture is we'll try to address the ways that old men experience their sexual lives. What we will do is we'll critically review the concept of sexual health as it has evolved in relation to old men. The author reviews this, the state's control of sexuality using the medical gaze, which obviously problematizes and then tries to control the narrative on men's sexual health, especially in terms of, initially it used to be in terms of STDs, sexually transmitted disease and infections, followed by resilience to the more recent reformation of sexual health as a we matter and not a we matter. So a powerful influence more recently is how aging men's sexuality is more and more discussed through the medical gaze. We've spoken about medicalization of men's health and its connection with reaffirming an ever-aging masculinity. So it's the medical script, the medical gaze is even more being applied to aging men. When men's sexuality is acknowledged in consumer promotions and discussed in gerontological and masculinity studies, the only thing that seems to occupy the bulk of the media space is erectile capability, erectile dysfunction, and by implication, coital intercourse. Impotence is a stigmatic word. It's been sanitized. So they removed the term impotence and they talk about ED. ED is erectile dysfunction. So they take away much of the personal failure and demasculating connotation of impotence. Now, sexual medicine discourse has converged with sexual health and also connected with the expansion of anti-aging medicine, whether it's allopathic or complementary alternative. And what it has done is it's increased the range, at least through advertisements, of medicine beyond managing individual men's sexual problems towards management of heteronormative sexuality. When men's sexuality is discussed using a medical gaze, its focus is mostly on erectile capability as something that shouldn't occur, as opposed to looking at it as an ordinary aspect of natural aging. The primary medical discourse obviously has consequences. So rather than worry about the actual libido, which is the urge to have sex, the focus is on the old man being able to continue to have an erection. So it's, quieted and marginalized by sexual medicine's cultural authority. There are hush-hush conversations about, men's dwindling virility and the stereotypes of post-sexual or asexual seniors, and of course the dirty old man who has continuing sexual desire. So all of these are, it's a very odd way to look at sexual health. So what medical discourse tries to do is it tries to insist that masculinity and sexuality are inseparably bound. So medical discourse on aging and sexuality, it transformed, or it has tried to merge masculinity and sexuality, and probably quite successfully. On one hand, keeping old men's sexuality as penis-centered with chemical support forever functional, what it has done is it has continued or extended the strength of never-aging masculinity, that discourse. Old men now confront a discourse that if they wanted to, or to maintain or to regain erections, they have to deal with this narrative. So Marshall, who in his work in 2011, he says the idea of a compulsory sexual retirement, which used to be the case before Cialis and Viagra, has given way to new promises of biomedicine to make sexual fitness a lifelong project. The failing rigidity of a man's penis is a man's problem. It's not a matter of aging. So they've made the rigidity of the penis a masculinity problem, not an aging normality. So that's the problem with the medical discourse. On the other hand, when you fashion erectile capability as a vascular or a blood flow condition that can be managed with lifestyle drugs, that started to be the cultural defense for active aging or healthy aging or successful aging. Medicine has definitely taken control of men's sexuality over the past, I would say, 15 to 20 years. Men's sexuality is now regulated by medicine's never aging discourse. Not so much by non-scientific groups or religious groups or arguments that regard sexual activity amongst old people as perilous. That's not it. The comment that sexuality is regulated deserves clarification, of course. But when you look at sociological discourses which talk about age inequalities, it's ordinary aspects of our existence, such as normal change in sexuality with aging, have unfortunately been problematized. So, they've been made issues by, unfortunately, big pharma and sometimes by our administrative bodies, our governments. So, the biomedicalization of men's sexuality, what it has done is it started to create the image that ED is a potential epidemic and it's a progressive disease. So Katz and Marshall in 2003, they state in their paper, consequently, both commercial and public health promotion discourses about positive aging, which I don't like that term positive aging, so anything else is negative or optimal aging. Anyway, so public health promotion discourses about positive aging have incorporated the fear of sexual dysfunction into more general models of healthy living. Paradoxically, the image of the erect penis, long the most vulgar of indecent exposures, is now elevated to the status of a vital organ, symbolizing the healthfulness of midlife successful aging. There are other studies that support the findings of Katz and Marshall, and they look at how quickly or how rapidly anti-aging narratives are starting to form a baseline or a floor for the biomedicalization of sex and securing the discourse on never-aging masculinities. In 1986, Stiefel argued that recasting aging men's lessening erectile rigidity into making it a hydraulic issue and a genitourinary matter rather than personal impotency trouble was part of a broader repositioning of medical boundaries to continue to feed into never aging masculinity philosophy. Now, initially, urologists were the initial practitioners of sexual medicine in men. And for sexual health, the concentration was primarily on sexually transmitted infections and reproductive matters. Now, they were obviously attentive to men's sexual functioning, and the International Society for Sexual Medicine in 1978, they developed the International Society for Impotence Research. It's obviously it's expanded beyond urologists, and now there are family practitioners, gynecologists, and others in a multidisciplinary approach to look at sexual health and treat both male and females for so-called sexual dysfunctions and to enhance sexual desire and satisfaction. It's quite evident now that sexual health practitioners basically presumed that health, quote unquote, health means proper physiological function. And again, when they say proper, it's a loaded term, rather than expansively looking at people's changing levels of desire or even variability in desire as their own practices of masculinity or femininity. In 1998, Viagra was discovered. And Viagra was introduced in 1998. Sildenafil citrate, which is the compound of Viagra, was discovered in 1994, and it was presented at the American Urological Association. That created the idea that, we can talk about forever functional and sex for life narratives, that they advanced the new masculinist imperative for never aging intercourse. Wenzel in 2017 has also called attention for how the biomedicalization of age-related impotence, it provides discursive push for healthy aging and successful aging. So that's the issue with all of this. Reviewing, so as this narrative is spread out more and more advertisement, there's more public acceptance of the medical discourse that's changing age-related impotence into a biological pathway. And Euro-American cultural ideals of masculinity and sexuality, as well as ageism and ableism, it feeds in well into the traditional scripts. So what was a normal age-related change started to be called as a dysfunction, and it needed to be treated. Typically, gay men were left out of this heteronormative discourse, and it, it was in support of the long-standing cultural meanings that were given to gay men's quote-unquote deviant sexual activity. So they were seen as illegitimate Viagra users. It's estimated that nearly a quarter to a half of American men, I'm not sure what the data is in Canada, but it's probably not too different. Between a quarter and half of men over 40 experience some degree of erectile difficulty. The degree to which erectile difficulties vary systematically with men's social location remains uncertain. So the connection hasn't been made as to socioeconomic status and ED. There is some evidence that erectile difficulty occurs more amongst men who are lower on the socioeconomic scale. And again, there's intersectionality of age, socioeconomic status, but not necessarily race or ethnicity that contribute to this variation among men. So when they look at a longitudinal study, which is a study done over a period of time, they look at the population, Massachusetts male population. So ED typically occurred more among men in blue collar occupations. So obviously more issues, because typically blue collar workers tend to buy into more strongly into a traditional masculinity, and having more ED tends to be more psychologically problematic there. So it's seen more in blue collar occupations. After considering other risk factors such as their lifestyle, their smoking habits, lack of exercise, perhaps other medical conditions. When we look at sexuality and health in later life, there is, as an older population, there is more pervasiveness of erectile difficulty. And part of it is men are living longer. So you are going to see more older men who have ED. That's just age is definitely an independent factor. Your vascular system ages. There's a reduction in blood flow to your groin. And there's other effects such as prostate enlargement, which also age is a factor for. So either an inflamed prostate or a removed prostate, drugs to treat prostate cancers or enlarged prostates, they all have an effect on the ability to have an erection. Other conditions, endocrine conditions such as diabetes, which we've discussed before, can be ethnic related as well. So there are a whole bunch of conditions, but basically with age, you see more of ED. Many aging men may be on multiple medication to manage other conditions, which might also affect their ability to get an erection. So Lohmann and his colleagues, they tried to estimate the prevalence of moderate to severe erectile difficulties by handing out a survey, where respondents had to respond by sometimes or never to the question, how would you describe your ability to get and keep an erection adequate for satisfactory intercourse? And they found that with age, sometimes or never seem to be more often in the oldest group of men who are aged 70 years or more. Um, and the percentages didn't differ that much by ethnicity. So 55% of white men, 54% of Hispanic men, and 50% of black men, they lived with impotency. Because of health inequalities, 40% or more of Hispanic and black men had started living with impotency much earlier in life, perhaps as early as their 60s. And also because there are some gendered other conditions that predispose, for example, diabetes and hypertension. In a different study, what Lindo finds that when she looks at sexuality and health amongst US older adults, uh, the primary lack of sexual activity amongst old men was there are other chronic physical conditions, not necessarily ED. About 40% of the 57 to 64-year-olds had other issues which would have interfered with sexual activity. Most evidence on the prevalence of ED has been based on findings from cross-sectional studies that show that as progressive older age occurs, there are more erectile difficulties. One longitudinal study, it looks at individual changes in sexual function over a 9-year period, and it finds that it starts as early as the 40s and then progresses through the years. So this is pretty consistent with age, that there is lower erectile function. Now, obviously, with the inability to have an erection, the frequency of coital sex has shown to be decreased. Now, the men, when they were interviewed in several studies, men were less likely to perceive these declines in as their decline in sexual health or as a problem or as a lack of sexual dissatisfaction. Most men come to live, they come to terms with their aging body and changes to the sexual health. So it makes sense that few men with moderate to severe erectile difficulties will consult a physician. Maybe 15 to 25% will actually talk to a doctor saying, well, I can't have an erection. Most US men who seek treatment and fill their prescription for erectile medication are typically younger than 60, and their daily lives are complicated by work and family matters. And they're involved typically in recoupling or coming out of a relationship and getting into another one. Amongst Australian men, what Hyde and colleagues found was that only about 8% of very old men tried to address their erectile difficulty using a physician. Typically, they normalize their erectile limitations as part of their aging. Similarly, even amongst British men who have easy access to a physician, no complex insurance situation like the US, only about 19% of the men who had ED actually reported seeking medical help for their condition. So this is counterintuitive because one association was that, well, if you have lower socioeconomic status, there's more incidence of ED and there's more attempts to seek help for that. The large majority of men with ED who do not seek medical help are typically married for a long time or in a long-term relationship. They may be troubled by the changes, but not troubled enough to seek chemical assistance in order to have sexual intercourse. The general pattern is that when aging men encounter barriers to being sexually active, they place less importance on sex. As there's a Six Nation comparative study And lots of responses from the men were like, you have to learn to accept, and their partners are willing to work around the problem. In addition, the response to erectile difficulty could be influenced by age. Typically, when men are diagnosed later than 60 or 65, they didn't tend to worry about it and they tended to be more accepting. Men who were seriously concerned and wanted to deal with it right away were in their younger years, perhaps late 40s, early 50s. And as we mentioned before, typically we're in the process of exiting and re-entering new relationships. I don't know how many people watch cable TV anymore. I haven't had cable TV for 11 years, and I don't believe everybody is the same. So if you have cable TV and watch a lot of American channels, there's a lot of overt marketing of late life sexuality. So it's called direct-to-consumer advertising, and typically American advertisements will tell you to go talk to your doctor about a certain drug, and it's the same for sexual drugs. There's a um, big deal made about the development of female Viagra, I think about 2 years ago, and the advertisements were nonstop. We were in the US at that time, and in a hotel room, you'd see a lot of ads, and I don't know what came of that. Anyway, so there's a lot of direct to consumer advertising of pharmaceutical cures, which promise to free men from their erectile troubles. In her analysis of Viagra, one of the researchers, Meiko Low, she argues that Viagra was initially touted as quote unquote coming to the rescue of men's personal troubles with erectile difficulties. It also suggested that it was rescuing generations of aging men who would be emasculated when, not if, their virility waned. There's little doubt that the advertising campaigns that marketed erectile medication created a discourse that never aging masculinity is protected whenever men can take control of their aging bodies. Essentially, if you can have an erection, you're still a man, and that's the discourse that was being promoted. So this problem is not life-threatening, having erectile dysfunction, but it can strike at the very essence of what it means to be a man, and it can affect your confidence. Now this is actually from Pfizer. Pfizer manufactures Viagra. This is Pfizer's promotional material, and that's what was being pitched to individuals in New Zealand. Bourdieu, who's done a lot of sociology on masculinity, he very shrewdly commented, the rush to procure Viagra shows that anxiety over physical manifestations of manliness is far from being an exotic peculiarity, because he's looking at the use of ED treatment drugs all over the world. So in a large part, new age pharmaceuticals, which are designed to assist midlife and old men maintain or reinstall their erectile function, it has narratives essentially touching upon men's sensitivity to losing their manhood. Erectile medication is presented as treatment for failing masculinity for heterosexual, usually white aging men. Erectile marketing also, what it does is it, other than having the script of an ever-aging masculinity and how ED is your savior to maintain your ever-aging masculinity, it also creates the false script of the penile vaginal penetration as the primary method of, as the primary and only normal normal form of men's sexuality, and it foreshadows every other form of sexual expression. And nothing about taking attention away from cuddling or just being in contact with one another or foreplay and stuff like that. Also, it's the focus of relationship seems to center on sex. So second wave advertisements have now drawn on a point of view that sex, particularly coital sex, is a necessary ingredient to maintain a sustaining relationship. And it's not just wanted by the man, but wanted by the women too. Both Viagra and Cialis are marketed as preserving the intimacy within couple relationship. The underlying implication is that close relationships depend on sexual intimacy of coital intercourse. Prioritizing pleasure, not just capability, recent Viagra and Cialis advertising will often present midlife couples holding hands, maintaining eye contact, or gently touching and kissing while they engage in joint activity. These couple-oriented advertisements privilege intimacy, relationships, and relational sex, as well as a man's partner expecting to be satisfied. So that's the narrative being created for men to watch. The partner is always a woman, so again, it's very heteronormative. And the message is a relationship without an erection and without penile vaginal penetration is problematic and is undesirable. So this is the message being put out there by the pharma industry. It's interesting how this imagery is created. You know, notably what happens with erectile medication advertising is they also employ cultural imagery. So what they do is when they talk about middle-class heterosexuality, they bring in images of affluent enough white men who have expensive gentleman motorcycles. They might have an antique convertible. This is and opportunities to vacation. Often you'll see a couple sitting on these nice Muskoka chairs, or the equivalent in the US, they're called Ticonderoga chairs or Adirondack chairs, on a beach-like location, holding hands, maybe in swimwear. So it's that kind of an image, and they argue that these advertisements naturalize a never aging form. And of course, it's always the people in the ad are white and heterosexual. Never aging masculinity that is closely related to virility and to erectile capacity for penile penetration of the female body. The Swedish Viagra website is a little bit different from websites in the US and New Zealand. They show how the man is always presented as able-bodied and physically active, and how the Swedish Viagra man is marked with, you know, culturally significant imaginary of freedom, naturalness, and aesthetized, you know, a form of a Swedish summer melancholy. So this narrow understanding of sexuality that is promoted through ED advertising is obviously not widely endorsed by men themselves, which is why a lot of them don't worry about having ED. In a survey-based study of late life in old men in New England, which is, you know, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, Thomson and Barnes found that most men they didn't see the need to have themselves treated, and they didn't buy into the idea that erectile ability is integral to being a man or to their masculinity. And the older they were, the more they walked away from the script. 1/3 of the men in this study, they reported that they experienced erectile difficulties. Half of them said that some of them said they used medication to assist in erection, but they didn't believe that having an erection was central to their manhood. So pharma companies are very smart. Pharma companies exist because people buy drugs and people ask their doctors for prescriptions to buy drugs, and they get their insurance companies to pay for them. The pharma company wasn't too thrilled that despite all their efforts to change the narrative on ED being central to being a man and to having intimacy and to having relationships, they started to play with the narrative a little bit. So more recently, they have started to deal with ED as a couples problem and couples sexual health, thereby getting the woman involved also in essentially helping sell their drug. So aging men who face ED problems, and typically the men that want the drug back is because they found um, sexual practices that they were able to do before. They found them extremely pleasurable, and they wanted to basically reclaim the sexual practice that him and his partner found pleasurable. So the men who took the drug didn't necessarily see it as a masculinity challenge and did not always necessarily buy into the narrative, but it was more to reclaim a sexual practice. Um, and this has been found amongst many studies, and not so much. This wasn't the result of feeling that masculinity was being lost. So it is well established that sexual activity is couple-centered and age-related. Um, Unfortunately, most men's studies, when they look at sexuality, men's sexuality, they discuss it in the constant context of the man alone. Now, that's those studies are generally not complete in themselves, because uh, if you're not talking about it as a couple, the complete picture simply doesn't exist. Now, the couples might be in many forms. There are couples who are in a late life living apart relationship. Those relationships are referred to as LAT or LAT relationships, where individuals are in a relationship in later life, but they're not necessarily living together. It could be a heterosexual relationship or a homosexual relationship. Um, so it's the focus, the study now is slowly shifting to studying the performance of sexuality in a couple itself. And it's also uh, the erectile capacity, at least in academic studies, is not necessarily that much of a focus. Neither is coital intercourse. Irrespective of what national descriptive studies are, the key determinant uh, in a lot of sexual health studies is the success of relationships. And at least the newer studies are showing, and the focus is not so much on coital success. Now, it would be unrealistic to think that um, unpredictable erections are not problematic for all partners. About 2/3 of women aged 65 and older who lacked any sexual activity over a 3-month period, whether it was coital sex or touching, said that their sexual inactiveness was determined by their partner's physical health problems. So not so much an ED issue, but that does change with age. And about 15 to 20% said that their lack of any type of sexual activity was because of their partner's loss of interest, not their own. In one study, a wife laments, um, she talks about her sexual satisfaction and about coital sex. And she talks about how she's unable to orgasm because he would lose his erection, and she found it very unsatisfactory. So potency, the ability to have penetrative sex, is now studied as a couple's issue. And typically, um, it was 2/3 of the women under 70 um, in certain studies claimed that they were quite troubled with their husband's erectile difficulties. So there's a comment from one of these studies: it has affected me a lot. Actually, you started feeling as though there's outside influences causing it, or you're getting fat, or you're not sexy anymore. You also wish that you weren't so wanting of your partner, because if you weren't, you wouldn't have the problem as much, if you know what I mean. So within the narratives of men and women in New Zealand regarding the impact of ED difficulties and Viagra use. Oh. Researchers looked at the wide-ranging erectile dysfunction stories and Viagra counter stories. So this conversational range, what it does is it breaks apart the reductionist medical never-aging masculinity view of sexuality in 3 different ways. First, what it does is before the man pursues the use of erectile medication, what these narratives do is that they show that couples may have already altered their sexual repertoires in ways that emphasize non-coital activities. Wives and husbands may have become more adventurous and experimental in terms of sexual pleasure because in some cases the wife is troubled or maybe sore by the likelihood of several episodes of chemically enhanced coital sex. Therefore, wives' preferences could be a factor in lessening coital sexual activity, and that so the activity could have changed already. Trompeter, Betancourt, and Barrett Connor, what they point out in their study of aging women's sexual activity and satisfaction, that nearly 3/4 of the oldest women reported low, very low, or no pain with vaginal penetration. Potts and her colleagues argue the advertising and cultural push to restore erections and penetrative sex to relationship, what it does is it undermines men's positive experiences with alternative sexual practices that they've come to recognize as enjoyable and satisfying for them and their partners. One man says, it's not the end all to have an erection, whereas I thought I had to. Now I know that it's not that important, What sort of came through with us is that the idea of a hard erection is to make penetration and all that, but it's not necessary. Woman's main sort of turn on is pretty close to the surface, and this idea of having a massive penetrating erection is not necessary for good sex. So finally, some of the men that Potts and a research team interviewed said how they were accepting bodily changes in general as a natural part of aging, including erectile changes. Others, of course, they were honest in revealing that their ED difficulties were quite devastating and how restoration with medication was ego-saving and masculinity restoring. Some other men noted that their sense of masculinity was uncompromised by their ability to have penetrative sex. So there's a lot of range of stories that Potts collected in 2004. The many stories and counter stories, whether it was Viagra dependent or Viagra independent, there's no standard experience. That they find it's pretty diverse, and how people saw their masculinity was also pretty diverse in the context of ED. So what the author, what Thompson wants to do, your textbook author, is he wants to talk about her work a little more in a later chapter. So we'll talk about it in a later lecture. But a larger qualitative study of older Swedish men and relationships reveals that sexual and romantic intimacy was still important to men. Demonstrating intimacy through penetrative sex didn't remain crucial for them to see themselves as men. They were able to accept a more quote unquote mature masculinity, which went beyond the typical coital sex that they were used to as younger people. So perhaps it's a time to rethink men's sexual health. It largely, because of the medical discourse, it remains, sexual health remains equated with sexual function, and never-aging masculinity is closely tied to the medical narrative of quote-unquote successful aging. There is obviously public health concern with the risk of STDs and STIs. And interestingly enough, one of the demographics that seems to present with a lot of STDs and STIs is older men over 50. Why mature and old men continue to become infected with STDs and STIs is not well understood. But there could be multiple factors. As a group, they probably seek new sexual partners. And the men who have been widowed or divorced recently may have a poor understanding of the importance of using a condom. or the risk for disease. And, perhaps only a few men talk about their sexual activity and sexual health with their care providers. So, with respect to the graying of men's sexual health, what is interesting is that aging uh, actually appears to facilitate coping with erectile troubles or with other barriers. While many men are likely to experience erectile difficulties, they're less likely to report it or to seek help most of the time. Part of it is because erectile problems are not instant. They emerge slowly. They are normalized as part of aging. And the men who do seek treatment, it's basically an attempt to reclaim a practice that they enjoyed a certain way. And most men choose to age or accept it. And, the author says age, quote unquote, gracefully. I'm not sure I buy that descriptive, but it's just an acceptance. Um, so sexual health is obviously not independent of a man's sexual partners or other determinants of men's lives. And that's all I want to say about men's sexual health. And I will open the floor for questions, comments. Hey, Brian.
So in terms of men's like sexual health, I think what I understand as male itself is that for men it's more their masculinity kind of wants them to perform. They want to be that masculine kind of guy, right? And it's all centered around their phallus, around if they can perform or not, whether they have good erection quality and stuff like that. And when they get to that point in life where they're experiencing ED or any erection related problems, they're immediately kind of concerned, not for themselves. What they're concerned about is, are they able to pleasure the woman, or are they able to make them happy, make them feel satisfied? That's the big issue. And I feel like that's kind of giving men this mental hindrance in terms of seeking assistance, or kind of having an open conversation about, hey, this is what's going on. Could you accept me for what's going on, or could you help me out through this journey, kind of deal? Would you say so? Would you say that would be like a big issue for men?
No, actually, the studies show the opposite. The narrative pushed by pharma company is that erections are important. Uh, Penile vaginal penetration is important. That's the way a woman is satisfied. That's the way you have intimacy, and that's the way you'll hang on to your relationships. That's the narrative being pushed by the pharma industry. But reality is showing that most men do not seek help for their ED. Okay, the men that do seek help tend to be somewhat younger, so in their 50s, early 60s, coming in and going out of relationships. It also seems to be associated with men in relationships where uh, the couple probably enjoyed a lot of penetrative sex and this was important to their intimacy. So those kind of men also sought help. So it wasn't the majority, typically it isn't the majority of men who seek help for ED. They tend to be more accepting of their situation. That's what I get from what the author has said in this chapter.
So in the real world, men would be more accepting towards their older age.
Correct.
Wow,
Despite all this bombardment of information.
it's very tough because I'm still young. A lot of young men are like always concerned about these kind of issues, right? So it's very hard for young men to visualize this, and it's a difficult concept.
Yeah, and I don't know what the cultural vibe is amongst young men. I'm middle-aged, okay? So and also I grew up in a very different culture. Where I was a young man, it was a different world altogether. So it's very different
Right.
forms of practice. So it's I hear you, and I will take your word for it. But it's hard to imagine what the feeling is, what the association of being able to have an erection and present it as part of your maleness is for young people. It's probably much more integrated for a younger person than it is for people who are getting older.
Oh, for sure. Because the problem is men think with their penis, and that's the issue here. and
Right.
that's that's the problem, because they're thinking with their penis, they're like, oh my goodness, I can't get a hard on anymore. I'm not a man. That's what young people kind of experience nowadays. Because if they can't get a hard on, they're like, oh shit, what's like, how do I define myself as a man now? And that was my whole dilemma here. I'm like, you get to the point where you have to accept this. And you're gonna have to live with your new transformation or manage this new transformation. But how are you doing this is the big question as a man, and that was really surprising for me. And
Yeah, and well, it's also age normative, right? When you get to a certain age, it's not really looked down upon if you can't automatically get an erection. But for a younger person where your testosterone levels are pretty high, to not be able to sustain or get an erection is probably more closely tied in with what they hear from their buddies, locker room talk, and all of that stuff,
right, right, yeah,
right?
for sure.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for that comment. That's very interesting. Melissa, you have your hand up next. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say to what Brian was saying that when you get older, and yes, it is normal for obviously people to experience ED and for both men and women's libido to decrease. That is normal, but it is also normal for one to still want to have coital sex and things like that. Like I've experienced it through a course in gerontology that I've taken, that like sex at age 60 plus is still normal. So it's not out of the norm to still want to do those things, but it is different for each individual, but it is both normal both ways. But like in the stats that we were reading, like I think it was like 55% or whatever experience the EDs and stuff like that. But I also pointed out, and I wrote in the chat, that I actually was surprised by that especially the men that have complete access to the medical centers are still choosing not to seek treatment for it and are kind of just accepting it. That's just a shock to me, because I guess I'm only 22. So to me, thinking about it right now, I'm just surprised.
Yeah, it's part of it is like I said, the men who for whom the couples, not I wouldn't say the men, the couples for who coital sex was very, very important, very pleasurable, they're probably going to pursue treatment for ED, because it's not about feeling like a man, it's about just getting back that pleasurable activity which is so important to their lives, right? So when they say like 30, 40, 50% or a lot of men with ED don't seek help, perhaps because it's progressive. It's not like you don't sleep one night and next day you have ED. It's slow, it's progressive, and you can see it
Right.
coming. So couples can easily adapt their sexual activity around it without
Right.
worrying too much about it. And then at some point, if you're getting enough pleasure out of sex without having to worry about penetrative sex, then who cares,
Mm-hmm. For
right?
sure.
So that's the way I read the chapter, and that's the way I understood it. Brian says, do women look down upon men who have ED? Just curious to see what the ladies think and feel about this. I'm not sure the women in the class want to out themselves with their opinions on this, but well, I guess there's an opinion there. Not look down necessarily, we would encourage to seek help. Okay, and I'm not going to insist that that question be answered. That's a question from Brian, and feel free to do with it what you choose. Brian, this is not a criticism on you. You asked a question and you are seeking an opinion. I understand that. Uh, I'm not going to make it my question. What else do we have? Brian, you have your hand up. Did you have a follow-up of some sort?
Oh no, my bad. I just have to put my hand down.
Okay, no worries, no worries. All good, all good. We have one more in the chat window. Erica Bulow. I don't think so, and many women would. It's not something men can choose to have, and they can seek help for it. Okay, so yeah, some answers to Brian's question. Do women look down upon men who have ED? Susan says no. As a woman, intimacy is as important as the sexual act itself. Yeah, so I would suspect that there would be a broad range of responses to your question, Brian. Uh, it's sexual activity is such an individualized thing, and people have such individualized preferences. So one form of sex which might be in the vogue when you're younger might transition to something else as you get older. So, and you know, uh, all right, I don't see any more questions. We actually finished. Or do we have questions, comments? Oh, there's a chat thingy up there. Thank you, Erica, Suzanne, and Melissa for your opinions. Glad to understand a female perspective on this. From Melissa to everybody, I wouldn't look down. It is a medical condition as any other. However, I would encourage to seek help. Mind you, it would be a conversation to have, and the conversation might be different based on what age we're at, and no problem. Fantastic, fantastic. Great discussion between students. That's always a good thing. We are supposed to have a 15-minute break at 10:30, and then we talk about social relationships. So what I'm going to do is, since we've finished a little bit early for a 15-minute break, we will, it's 10:25 now, we will meet up back at 10:40 to talk about social relations. We'll take our 15-minute break a little bit earlier, 5 minutes earlier today. Okay, so we will see everybody back in 15. Thank you all. Teresa says, I can speak as an older woman. The onset of episodes of ED might even be welcomed because her libido might be decreasing as well, as long as the couple remain close and connect sexually from time to time. Thank you. That's a great perspective, Teresa, and an alternative perspective presented compared to the other one. So that's good to have a range. Go. All right. So this is about social relationships for aging men. A couple of quotes that have been attributed to a couple of different people. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. The other one is social relationships, both quantity and quality, have short and long-term effects on health, for better and for worse. And these effects emerge in childhood and cascade throughout life to foster cumulative advantage or disadvantage. So the second quote feeds into what most students who have taken some gerontology recognize as a life course perspective. So life course trajectories are similar in the sense that they encompass alterations in the convoy of social relationships. And what that means is we go through a lot of different changing social relationships throughout our lifespan, and it's the same for all old men. That's commonly shared. So the similarity of change is pretty common. The only thing someone else has said, and I don't know who has, but I've heard this often. The only thing constant about life is change, and that seems to apply here. So the composition of men's social relationships can be due to normative life events such as retirement, widowerhood, as well as off time and unexpected events such as late life divorce or men becoming their partner's care provider. Whether it's normative or off time, a common sequel in all of this reorganization of their social lives and their preference to engage themselves within smaller, stronger networks that prioritize emotionally satisfying interactions. That seems to be a common theme. The research on narratives on old men's later life, what it reveals is that many old men's taste for stepping back from the rhythms of work-based masculinities and welcoming the experience that might center on dinners and conversations and friends and participating in other emotional emotionally supportive acts is quite common, regardless of culture, regardless of location. The focus of this lecture component, as well as chapter 8, is to basically call attention to old men's social relationships in later life. So what the author does is he directs attention, obviously he uses a life course perspective, to the advantages and disadvantages of different partnership statuses. So this is one way he addresses the diversity amongst old men's lives. The author uses partnership status as a window into old men's social worlds because their lives do pivot around their partnership status, and they're affected obviously by the disadvantages or advantages of their sexuality, their class, their health. What we also look at in this chapter are the differing social worlds of old men in relationships, never married old men, divorced old men, and widowed old men. I know we have an entire chapter dedicated to widowerhood, which will be covered by two groups of students tomorrow. So we don't, this chapter doesn't go into great detail, but there is some exposure to that concept. Until recently, old men's social lives and relation identities tended to be discussed in terms of the retirement transition, because traditional view of gender, what it did is it emphasized men's and women's roles and separate geographies. Men's participation in the workforce as laborers or as employees or as white collar professionals, it's long been theorized as one of their primary identities. So the stresses and privileges of retirement after 30 to 40 years of employment were thought to define later life. When we think about an example of the community of co-workers that previously helped organize the men's everyday day-to-day relationships, they kind of go away with retirement, and the social lives of old men become more and more concentrated within the post-employment community of friends and family. How old men from different classes or men who are not in a couple relationship, how they experience the shrinking of their social network, it obviously varies from a typical heteronormative man. For example, for men without financial security to retire, their late life network may continue to involve work-based relationships, which bolsters their sense of never-aging masculinity. For wealthier men, they have the opportunity to leave the workforce, but it takes away all the workplace relationships that they had. Friends and intimate partners or wife, siblings, and family, they form their networks after retirement. The author looks at the appraisal of old men's social lives. He starts by looking at married couples because the vast majority of old men, this is statistically accurate for the US, I believe it's quite accurate for Canada as well. The vast majority of old men are living with a spouse or an intimate partner. So their lives revolve around this couple relationship. In order to simplify this, what the author does is he limits the discussion to heterosexual couples. Not that he's ignoring gay couples, but it's to talk about just the context of a relationship. So he talks about heterosexual couples, and he talks about the situation in which it's a happy relationship, not antagonist. Can't say the word. Anyway, where the couples aren't in a conflict. Now, many older couples can have high levels of distress when there's health declines or there's a lifestyle transition, debt, but partners generally sense in a happy coupling, partners derive a sense of well-being and purpose by leaning on one another. And older couples generally tend to show less potential for conflicts and greater potential for pleasure than younger and middle-aged couples. So a snapshot profile of the aging population at any moment will show that 3/4 of the men over 65 and older are living with their spouse. This estimate is shared in the US, the UK, in Germany, and in Japan. It's overestimated the number of people, old men in a couple relationship. Sometimes what is not considered is the old men in a couple relationship who are not cohabiting. For example, lat partnerships, living apart together. So I have a couple who have been close friends of mine for over 15 years, who are in a lat relationship. They don't necessarily live together, but they are together, but they live separately. So that's not, that's understudied and undercounted. As invaluable as they are, the snapshot only details the moment and not the movement in and out of relationships as well. When you look at the snapshot of people in a couple relationship. No, marriage is a nomos building, or it fits the rules. It's when we read about habitus, fields, and nomos, it it's a field in which it builds, it follows the rules of the field. It's an ongoing process where people have a common feeling, a canopy, their marital habitus, which provides a taken for granted sense of stability and natural security. So the couple acquires a protective cocoon and comes to feel the bodily and psychic ease in the routine circumstances of everyday life, according to Giddens. When they put together whatever research findings are available, it's the couple's reciprocal emotional work and emotional support that improves the quality of their felt quote unquote we as a couple as they age together. So the more emotional work that each partner puts into the relationship for the other and for themselves, the closer the couple is. Typically, when the husband is asked directly about his emotion work, the husband is usually puzzled because because he construes his emotion work simply as part of his relationship with his wife, and he thinks he's simply quote unquote doing marriage. In the US, old men who are of European or Asian ancestry, but 3/4 are living with their spouse. 2/3 of Hispanic men live with their spouse, a slightly lower proportion. And about half of old Black men live within a couple relationship. So there is an ethnic statistic in the U.S. We don't know what the breakup is in Canada as to what how many white old men are married versus other visible minorities or people of different ethnicities, and we should be able to locate that from Stats Canada if you're ever curious. But since it doesn't necessarily directly apply to making the point, I'm not going to get into that data right now. But there is a link between ethnicity and which affects being coupled, and the cumulative advantages or disadvantages of being coupled. So there are the advantages of couples ties typically revolve around 5 dimensions, according to the author. He says caring, intimacy, family feeling, commitment, and reciprocal identity support. So these are the 5 advantages. These are the 5 dimensions through which there could be advantage or disadvantage. He talks about the first, he talks about caring. Caring develops through years of mutual concern and affection. When he talks about intimacy, he talks about intimacy is derived from years of being in a dyad where habitual daily interaction and couple secrets are created. When he talks about family feeling, he says that family feeling is the sense of being partnered, and with this comes the symbolic and lived intergenerational connections. He talks about commitment as it is the intention to maintain the quote unquote we, and reciprocal identity support is how each partner becomes and is defined by the we. And the author also says that there are the cumulative advantages and quality of life that marital intimacy usually provides. For example, there are not too many longitudinal studies that are available to affirm a sex for health causal order, as opposed to finding that people's later life health regulates their sexual activity. Most aging couples remain sexually intimate, which promotes a higher quality of life and good physical health. So one of the most identity defining relationships for old heterosexual men is their marriage. Um, Once a man is married, his identity becomes that of a quote unquote husband. For the generations of old men who were born before World War II, being a husband was what was normal, and it was almost a publicly affirmed masculinity. Despite this, aging men's self-conception as a husband or as an intimate partner, it's quite under-researched. The evidence that the author finds comes mostly from the studies of heterosexual husbands. When asked, married men, and in particular old men, what they acknowledged was that their lives as a husband was their principal identity, because that's the one thing they didn't think would change. Um, being employed, being a boss, being a manager, those things they recognize as being transitory. While studying the retirement transition, Winnick and Eckert, what they discovered was that being a husband was a master status, so, that bridged the men's pre and post retirement autobiographical narratives. So the identity as a skilled tradesman or a mechanic or a dentist or a manager, those might remain in the man's mind even after he exits the workforce. But being a husband and being part of a marital dyad, that remained the man's predominant identity. Uh, in other studies as well, married and partnered men from 8 different countries around the world, they rated having a good relationship with a wife or a partner 9 times more important to the quality of life than having a satisfying work-life balance or a career. So being a husband and being the male partner in a couple dyad seems to be rated very, very highly by men. It is lifelong marriages or lifelong marital relationships. They remain the comparative norm uh, whenever later life living arrangements are scrutinized. Even though the romanticized image of the lifetime and the one and only marriage, it's not the only reality in most developed countries. There is a grain of accuracy to that image. In the UK, 65% of marriages that began in 1968, those couples celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, and 45 to 50% will celebrate their golden anniversary if both spouses live that long. In the US too, 60% of the men married in 1960 to 64 celebrated their 40th anniversary. So even though there is a recognition that forever marriages are not a reality, it still seems to be it still seems to dominate over multiple relationships or alternate forms of coupling relationships. Um, for the old men whose marriages ended, becoming a widow still outpaces divorce, although a rising share of marital endings after age 50 are voluntary. Now, it would be false to think that all of these marriages are happy. There is a proportion of old men in these long-term marriages which are of low quality, which obviously affects both spouses' well-being and health. Um, and of course, there are marriages where the man relies exclusively on the woman for emotional support, especially as his post-retirement circle of social relations shrinks. Obviously, what this will result is in further privatizing of his social world because he's becoming more and more dependent on his partner. This would obviously constrict her autonomy and it might trigger her likelihood to consider a divorce. Uh, Consistent with this, aging married men experience a lot more social loneliness than women, and both spouses' emotional loneliness is it rises with higher levels of marital disagreement regarding spousal attentiveness. There is a rising incident of what we know as gray divorce, which is folks over 50 and in their 60s getting divorced. It is often seen in empty nesters as well. So, despite the fact that there is a greater incidence of what is called quote unquote gray divorce and the stereotype that old married men drive their wife crazy after retiring, most of old men's time is spent within a couple relationship that provides mutual companionship and enjoyment and satisfaction and intimacy, as opposed to quarrelsome or stressful exchanges. Definitely the latter occurs as well. Closeness and intimacies improve typically with age, and that's probably because spouses spend more time with one another. In the context of satisfactory marriages or similar relationship, closeness is performed as quote unquote support and being responsive to one another's needs. That also communicates caring. Of course, one could argue that the reason aging men are interested in spending time within intimate and family relations is because the intimacies strengthen their own core identities and health. Now, this is not voiced by men themselves, but families do provide them a haven. And if there are children, grandchildren, there's a lot of pronounced intergenerational connectedness, then there's a sense of legacy as well. So, several studies show that the regularity of exchanges of support within families and the benefit that men derive from being married or partnered, um, this is operationalized in terms of uh, the man's nourished feelings of being a man or of overall well-being. The long tradition of research on benefits of being coupled, so there's a lot of research on that. So there is compelling evidence that coupled relations absolutely benefits men's health. Now, these are not limited to aging heterosexual men within marriages. Even partnered gay men have better reported self-health and they have less evidence of depression, irrespective of how long the relationship is, when it's compared to single aging gay men. Similarly, men who were either daters, so heterosexual men who were either daters or they were unpartnered, they report poorer uh, perception of health than heterosexual men who were either married or cohabiting or in lat relationships. And the men who were partnered typically reported lower depressive symptoms and perceived less stress. Of course, the caveat is that health benefits hinge on the quality of the couple's relationship. So it's not uh, a poor quality marriage, an argumentative, quarrelsome marriage is not going to lead to better reports of health and satisfaction and less depressive symptoms. In fact, that could drive depression even more. And so partnering, it's just a reiteration that I wanted to make that partnering benefits both heterosexual and homosexual men, and overall health is significantly, reported health is significantly improved. So next we talk about single old men. There are different kinds of single old men. The population of single old men is not a homogeneous group. It's quite diverse. It's quite heterogeneous. There are many cultural groups within this that have a variety of life experiences and tastes and varying access to social and economic capital and different living conditions. And of course, the diverse ways that single old men, they perform their masculinities, express their sexuality. Whether someone's involvement with this group is at some distance as a researcher or it involves directly working with single old men, when attention is paid to diversity, what we understand is that uh, these men's unique and shared experiences, um, it is specific to the context, the region, their ethnicity and class. So we first start the conversation by talking about the never married men. So for the most part, research has neglected never married old men, who are about in the States, it's about 4 to 8% of old men in most European countries. So that should probably parallel with what we see in Canada. I don't know for a fact, but with some exceptions, for the most part, 4 to 8% of old men are never married. Never married old men they're a diverse ethnic racial population. Uh, they're quite diverse, but there is a bimodal split. What a bimodal split means is that if you look at a graph as to the distribution of these individuals, a normal distribution would be a bell-shaped curve. A bimodal distribution would have two bell-shaped curves for any of you who have done any statistics. We can discuss a bimodal distribution later if anyone has questions or wants to clarify. But for right now, I'll just explain that it is the distribution of never married men as far as socioeconomic status is a bimodal distribution. That means you have people who are extremely well off, never married, and you have people with very low socioeconomic status who have been never married. And obviously they differ in terms of why they never married and why they live alone. Now, there are several distinct subgroups of the never married people. So you have never marrieds, you have old men who have dated extensively, but they never married because things never worked out. You have never married men who simply chose to live alone. They're not socially isolated. These men have enough social capital derived from other relationships with friends and family and experience above average life satisfaction, even compared to their married age peers. A third type of never married old men are those who think about marriage but don't end up marrying, but they live in a living apart relationship or a lat relationship. And then there are the old men who never married because they're on the social margin, they live reclusive lifestyles, they're usually economically disadvantaged and often in poor health. So as to the question of why never married men who didn't marry, never married men who prefer their lifestyles of living singly may date often, they may date regularly, but they don't couple. They prefer maintaining their independent lifestyle and to live separately and distance themselves from what they call the trappings of being in a relationship. The example is of Amir, who's aged 80, and he says, quote, "When I ask myself how come I stayed single, my answer is that being single is a result of certain narcissism. Here, I'm used to a life of peace and quiet. I have what I want, and when I want it, it doesn't work that way when you have children." Um, so this is one of the opinions. Never married singles, whether they're heterosexual or gay, who live alone and still maintain intimate friendships and family relationships, particularly with siblings, they're not likely to be either emotionally or socially lonely just because they have all these different connections who they are constantly in touch with. Yet compared to the men who have coupled, never married, are typically more vulnerable in later life to having less social capital and support, particularly because few have children to assist them when care is needed, and for most, no live-in partner is there to monitor unspoken needs. Among heterosexuals, greater never marrieds are have a greater vulnerability to social isolation, and it's well documented. These men are more likely to entertain in their homes and hardly ever or never visit friends or relatives when compared to men who have been coupled. Yet, as it's suggested by Davidson, it may be that many heterosexual never marrieds they prefer social isolation and not visiting or hosting friends, and do not feel compelled to maintain a complex network of kin. Um, uh, they have established themselves in a place of residence and are accustomed to living alone. So, as Davidson's study suggests, never marrieds are alone, but most are not lonely. They found that unpartnered, another study found that unpartnered older gay men in New York were no more isolated than old men in general, and in fact reported a greater number of friends among the population of New York's older adults. It's just interesting that our opinion of people who are not in a relationship, not coupled, not married is an artificial image of them being lonely. This is not really the case. Now, several never marrieds who live in lat relationships or who cohabit, they can be in long relationships, but the proportion of never marrieds who otherwise couple in some form, it's not well studied or understood. Even among the men that census data classifies as never married and living as singles, they may date one person and may never define themselves like perhaps on Facebook as being, quote, in a relationship, unquote, because they infrequently get together with their dating partner who lives far away. And they might be actively involved in a living apart relationship that provides intimacy with the autonomy of being by themselves. I take a look at the divorced men. Among aging men who were previously married in the US, UK, or Japan, um, demographics show that what ended men's marriage, the reasons have shifted in recent decades. Um, and the numbers have changed. A larger proportion of men is divorced and a smaller share is widowed. This was previously, this was not the case, it was the other way around. And for a majority of men, their marital dissolution used to be caused by the death of a spouse. To understand gray divorce or divorce in later life, lifelong marriages are, Brown and Lindsay, lifelong marriages are increasingly difficult to sustain in an era of individualism and lengthening life expectancies. Older adults are more reluctant now to remain in empty shell marriages. And so again, adding to this, what Lynn and colleagues, what they note that lesser marital quality, not so much the onset of an empty nest or a partner's retirement, was what elevated the risk of a gray divorce. Marital breakups amongst graying couples occur more commonly among younger couples, some who had been married at least 25 years. Now, these dissolutions of marriages typically seem to reflect the wife's decision to move on and not the husband's, according to Wu and Schimmel. Marriages may endure despite an emptiness, but research, what it shows is that wives reach the breaking point sooner than husbands when personal happiness is low enough and there is an interference from in-laws. And when the wife sees her future time as alone and in control and perhaps repartnering as a better option, typically wives who leave tend to be economically independent. An analogy that the author sometimes suggests that what he hears is great divorces are not, they're not preceded by an emotional earthquake that sways the marriage. It's usually the small cracks in the quality of married life that eventually push the wife or the husband away. Another analogy that the author talks about uses the metaphor of the balloon slowly leaking air but not bursting. Life on the other side, as a single, again for women, it's expected to be less burdensome and less distressing. Many aging men typically experience their uncoupling as an unwelcome, surprising turning point. Many may end up sheltering themselves at work and they will talk about feeling empty and living alone and an interest in repartnering. The men's repartnering is desired and supported by the evidence that's there in aging divorced men's movement out of and into relationships. Almost half of middle-aged men and old men's divorces ended a marriage that itself was a remarriage. Family study researchers have noted that divorce has a self-fulfilling character about it that makes a second more probable, and many married older adults are in second or higher order marriages. In Canada, what was seen in 2016 by Shamel and Wu is within 10 years of a divorce, about 20% of the men had or were in a cohabitation relationship, and about 30% remarried, which means 50% of men typically within 10 years after their divorce have repartnered. The older the men at the time of their marital dissolution, the less likely they were to repartner. Similarly, in the US, roughly within 10 years of marriage dissolution, half of divorced men had repartnered, just like the Canadian example. Now, demographic profiles about divorced men's relationship trajectories, what they do is they homogenize lived experiences, saying they're about the same, which is not accurate. Aging men construct their own meaning of the same event, the same divorce, in many, many contrasting ways that go missing when you look at these very broad profiles. There's an experience of several different things: bitterness, resentment, regret, hurt, loneliness. These are negative emotions that leak into divorced men's narratives. There are positive feelings that might also exist, and they might range from being relieved, and they might speak about being unconstrained. So there's an example of a man called Jeff stating, this is from Canham's study in 2014, "I'm way more independent, I feel a lot freer." And that could be an experience as well. So there is a lack of qualitative studies in looking at narratives. So there's less of an insight as to how old men experience being divorced and getting older. So because divorce is a very challenging transition for most men, making meaning of the divorce itself and the lived experience of being divorced in later life is quite emotionally complex. And it does have its own impact on masculinity discourses. So there's limited theory and research comparing aging men's repartnering patterns, looking at findings, to be able to think about all of this. So for example, a late middle-aged man, a young old, 60, 62 years old, and an old man, both if they experience an unwanted divorce and neither wants to go back into a relationship, what are the cumulative disadvantages the men experience following this decision? Is it different for the young old versus the old old? These are the kind of studies that would be more useful. Does emotional healing alone following the wife's decision to terminate the marriage prove to be more advantageous than sheltering himself in a new relationship and hoping that repartnering heals his wounded masculinity? Does that apply to both types of old men? For the divorced aging men left by their former wives and partners, are they more cautious about starting a new relationship, or are they feeling vulnerable and they want companionship? So with younger generations of aging men living longer and generally in better health than older generations, are there generational inequalities in the accumulated advantages or disadvantages? So these are a list of questions that we really don't know the answer to because it's not well studied. The lack of studies, obviously, it challenges our understanding of how context differentially affects how men experience being divorced or being single again and then getting older. There is a thinking phase or a deliberation phase and then a resolution phase, according to Canham, that may differ quite a lot depending on what the faith background is, what ethnic community the man comes from, what class, and what locality. Divorced men's narratives show us a range of discourses on masculinities that reveal the habitus of their faiths, classes, ethnic communities, and localities. Divorce narratives can include the angry, wounded soul who feels aggrieved by what he looks at as her emotional infidelity arising from her close relations with friends and family, or the lonely, lost old man picture who mourns a different dream and feels unnerved and empty by her decision to walk away. And then, of course, you have the resilient single who feels freed and excited by becoming a bachelor again. Uh, but again, the analysis of late life divorce have been predominantly gender comparative, leaving the variability um, within old men's narratives poorly heard. Now, based on the author's conversation with divorced old men, his sense is that their talk about living alone, interest in new intimacies, and restructured relations with their adult children is not the sole purpose of their personal narratives of the individuals, but they are actually discourses on the masculinity that they're embodying. So he has two examples. He talks about Terry, who is a controlling head of the family, and he's a professor, university professor, a STEM professor, science, engineering kind of professor in his early 70s. And his younger wife decided to end his marriage. And so he sees it as ending, quote unquote, his marriage and rupturing, quote unquote, his retirement dreams. And his response to that was he was stunned and he sheltered in an apartment and he hid himself in his work for a few years. Then he retired and moved far away to begin living as a bachelor. So his narrative was his discourse was that of being a resilient, sturdy oak. Uh, that's the kind of masculinity he chose to see his actions as, and it offered fresh opportunities to reclaim himself. Keela, let's see, there we go. On the other hand, Randall, traditional Catholic in his early 60s, when his wife, without warning, according to him, ended his identity as a husband, leaving him a note telling him to move out immediately and promptly selling their homes. He dealt with the divorce quite differently. He sheltered in the continuity of his work and identities as a successful IT report specialist. His narrative used discourses on the absent marriage, and he, you know, his narrative dwelt on, quote unquote, how shall I live, those kinds of thoughts, because he recognized that he's still a man but not necessarily a husband, so it's the end of one identity. There's a comment in the chat window. I will get to it once we get to the end of the slide. Divorce stories don't often end with, quote unquote, all is okay or with no regrets. One partner is obviously aggrieved enough with the quality of marriage to initiate the uncoupling. Often with gray divorces, it's often more the woman than the man. And the other typically can be relieved or can feel blindsided. Initiators may take their time to make the decision on the divorce. They may have thought about it for years. They prepare emotionally and mentally for the divorce, so they are far more at peace when they file for divorce, and they find positive meaning in terminating the relationship. Identifying who initiated the marital breakup can be rather arbitrary, since the person who initiated is storied after a decision to divorce and has been presented, and the couple weigh that decision, so it's not unilateral. Divorce stories are an ongoing interpretive process, and between late life couples, both the initiator of the divorce conversation and the other partner are likely to face an extended time in the unwinding of the relationship, even after the legal divorce. And yet they may engage in less overt conflict because of their heightened ability to effectively manage or ignore negative emotion and leave well alone. So there's a whole bunch of post Grey divorce anecdotes that the author has, and it's um, there are several backgrounds provided. They talk about six old men that the author of your textbook interviews, and he talks about their involvement in uh, repartnering. Some of them are involved, some of them are shy of repartnering, some of them involve themselves in work and so on. And that's the last section that he talks about divorced men, and you can go ahead and read it. It's interesting, but doesn't necessarily make a point as far as I'm concerned, so I'm not going to worry about that. But what I am going to do is I'm going to look at the comment chat window, because I believe there's a comment that I would like to look at. Akila says, sorry, I got kicked out. I don't know how. Well, Akila, I can assure you it wasn't me. I'm not in the habit of kicking out my students. Yeah. All right, let's see what's next. Widowers. As I said, there's going to be a much more extensive presentation on widowers, but there's a little bit here, so we will talk about it. Widowerhood is not commonly spoken, it's not a commonly spoken about concept. It feels clumsy, and it has its origins in medical related investigations of men's health following their wife's death. Basically a study of the broken heart syndrome, as it used to be called. It was used as an explanation to talk about elevated risk of cardiovascular death in the stressful first 6 months of bereavement. Now, a broken heart, quote unquote, broken heart does not necessarily cause an elevated risk of death. It's rather a widower's social relationships and daily practices that change after his wife that dies that may actually trigger changes in his health, such as heavier alcohol use or becoming housebound or not exercising, maybe troubled sleep, irregular eating, poor diet, not taking your medications. Those might really be the cause. Now, for many years, spousal bereavement and people's lived experience as widowers were discussed as if both experiences were gender neutral. So whether you're a widow or whether you're a widower, for the longest time, at least into the 70s and early 80s, it was pretended that it was experienced the same way. Now, in the 70s, Helen Lopata focused her research on widowhood rather than bereavement alone. Now, she flagged the brute realities that in all nations it was women who commonly survived the death of a husband and were socially disadvantaged vis-a-vis widowers. And they still are, but less likely so now than in the 70s, where the disparity was quite significant. Now we have a comment. We will address it at the end of the slide. Nonetheless, heterosexual widowers now experience later life with better economic and social capital and the opportunity to establish new relationships with a wider age range of partners if they so choose. Now, men's transition from marriage into widowerhood can be more challenging, and each aspect of this transformative process is affected by the men's other identities and other statuses. Generally speaking, widowers' narratives, it'll tell the story of their shock, their profound sadness and numbness as they live through their wife's or partner's life-ending illness and death, especially if the death was unexpected. So what follows bereavement is a jarring discontinuity in their daily routines as they start to reconstruct their social work and their identity now as a widower. More so than their divorced peers, old widowers experience high levels of single strain. And researchers have defined this as the chronic stress aging men and even aging women when they're widowed, they attribute to being unmarried. Perhaps this difference is related to widowers being single involuntarily, a loss of control, perhaps. The initial phases of becoming a widower are known to be painful as much as awkward. They don't have too many comparisons to others who are widowed. Their marriage may have included the intensity and closeness of the men's unpredicted and unanticipated care work to ease their partners or their wife's dying and a roller coaster of emotions. Then there's the existential crisis that comes about by the loss. And of course, there's a threat to their natural security that marriage provided. Now, throughout the bereavement phase of becoming a widower, there might be a persistent psychological bond to the deceased partner. And there might be difficulty finding solace within the limited network that a widowed man might have. For aging gay men who lose a partner or a spouse, other people's lack of respect for their partner relationships and their new life as a widower can complicate, if not worsen, their grieving. It wouldn't be uncommon to hear about an aging gay man whose place of employment didn't give him bereavement leave. This is now, this is in the older context. We don't see that in Canada and several states in the US. We don't see that either. But, bereavement leave may be denied or used to be denied if the man wasn't in a heterosexual relationship. So that's less the occurrence, but this is talking about a slightly older context. For aging heterosexual and gay men, the construct, quote unquote, widowhood, what it does is it immediately recognizes their experiences as gendered. There are a few widower issues, mostly man issues. So more than the problem, the quote unquote problem, the phenomena of being a widower, which emphasizes the initial and lingering troubles associated with bereavement, researchers have now started to look at the range, the diversity of widowers' experiences, and they question how old men's social worlds without a wife transform and how they continue to write their biographies of men. And this newer generation of research, it looks at the variability because of class, ethnicity, duration of marriage, geographies and cultures, etc. Now in 83, which, well, 83 doesn't sound so far back to me, but when I think about it, that's 37 years ago. Is it 37? Yeah, it must be. So studies in 1983 by Parks and Wise cued a distinctive, what it did is it looked at initial responses of heterosexual widowers to the loss of their wives. Now in those earlier studies, the men spoke about what had happened to them as if they had been dismembered, a part of their body had been chopped off rather than abandoned. They experienced, and now you're to think about the 80s when systems were far more patriarchal than they were today, and the wife was in a quote unquote traditional female role. I wouldn't say female role, a woman's role, and the man had traditional masculine script, more so than today. So anyway, so the men experienced widowhood as if they'd been dismembered. Most of heterosexual widowers related, when they were studied, it was recognized that they felt as a big loss of their identity when they lost their spouse, and it was almost like a whole body experience, and the identities were, as husband was suddenly severed. and their everyday lives as a couple was gone. Part of the natural foundation on which the masculine subjectivity and capital were based doesn't exist. They were not husbands anymore. And as we discussed before, being quote unquote husband in most cultures is very important to men, even to this day. So even more recently, when you look at men's stories, they talk about the wife as being a part of them. She was my right arm. Even aging gay widowers equally narrate the loss of their partner as having lost a part of their body. So, there's a quote saying, "Part of my soul has been amputated." Old men who have been married or partnered for several decades experience loss in this manner. Um, there is an increasing recognition that culture, class, religious or spiritual tradition, and masculinities all have a powerful impact on what might be called emotional grieving. Widowers have a range of patterns of grief work, sometimes guided by typical hegemonic masculinity ideologies. Kate Bennett, in 2007, she looked at the ways that old men managed bereavement in terms of the dilemma about showing emotional vulnerability. Most widowers disclosed how they tried to keep their grief hidden and maintain a strong front of performance of keeping a stiff upper lip, even though many could not maintain that disguise. Many of them confessed to having crying maybe at least once a day, if not more. But the men typically chose to suffer in private and away from the public eye because, again, they were subscribing to the traditional masculinity narrative. Of course, they revealed that they did not cry in front of others because this is stereotypically considered sissy stuff. Even as grieving widowers, they felt they needed to masquerade their grief. Now, in Bennett, in her study of British widowers, noted that many men regarded themselves as independent and resilient and quote unquote sturdy oaks, and their emotional expressions of grief only happen in private. These men disclosed in comparison how troubled they were. So they describe their emotions in terms of control, rationality, successful action, responsibility to others. Their delivery is calm and deliberate, although the content is emotional. It is presented in a masculine fashion using the language of control, reliability, and success. It is not that they are denying their experience, it's rather that they are demonstrating their masculinity and incorporating their feelings into their masculine personae. All right, we'll take a couple. I believe there are a couple comments, maybe one comment in the chat window. All right. So it appears that there are still a few challenges with people getting either booted off or with poor audio video quality occasionally. My recommendation is as follows. Everything is getting recorded. Anything that you want, the best way to make sure that you're caught up on everything is to review the videos or even go through the chapters when you have time. That might be even faster. I'm not, I feel bad that this is occurring, and it could be because all schools in the US have started this week, and there is a lot of online learning in different US states, and Zoom is being used extensively. That was one of the reasons we had a massive outage on Monday. So I guess there's, from time to time, it can affect students' abilities to remain in the classroom. If you get booted out, just get into the waiting room and I'll let you in. So, and this applies to everybody. And there is a website. I'll try to show you guys the website. You can test your internet speeds. So it kind of tells you, it's called speedtest.net. So if you go to speedtest.net, it has this little go icon, wait for the page to load. You can do it during lunch break or whatever. And if you hit this, what it does is it'll tell you your internet speed. And right now I'm online, I'm doing a Zoom chat with screen sharing, so it's probably taking a lot more time, but it gives you a good sense of your internet speed. So it tells me I'm at 1 Mbps. Typically, if I'm not running something, my internet speed is about 10, 15, 20 Mbps. Usually anything above 1 Mbps is quite sufficient to have a good Zoom connection. More is obviously better. Oh, thank you, Melissa. Melissa says that's a great website. I don't know if you knew about it before, but in case you didn't, you can definitely use speedtest.net to check your internet speed. Typically, anything more than 1 Mbps is good enough speed. You shouldn't have issues with Zoom. And if you know, all right. Let's get back to the slideshow. We have a couple more slides and then we'll break for lunch. Okay. Oops, sorry. For some widowers, the hole or the gap in their lives that they feel during bereavement, it can linger for years into widowerhood. In Davidson's study, in her study, she comments that not one of the 10 widowers who cared for their wife admitted to any sense of relief when she had died, and said that they felt lost without the routine that they'd established while looking after her. So it's the loss of identity as carer, which is often seen in several widowers. So also what Parks and Weiss find in their longitudinal studies is the most emotionally troubled men are more likely to remain troubled. It just seems that the turning point in the widow's acceptance of their wife's death coincides with no longer feeling the need to avoid reminders and being able to recall their wives without the intensity of emotional pain. This does not mean that widowers and, of course, widows no longer maintain a tie to their deceased spouse. So, it's the moving on part. It takes a while. In 1996, Moss and Moss, they talk about how a widowed person's relationship with the deceased spouse, it includes strong themes of letting go but still holding on to those memories and those positive things. These two themes are intertwined. They're not opposites, and you don't have to do one to do the other. um, as much as their marital relationship for widowers had given them a sense of normalcy and stability, most old widowers, they eventually accept their wife's death and they accept their unexpected status as widowers. Old men who are functionally independent and they accept their wife's death, they may begin to seek companionship, love, and sexual intimacy. Um, Research work by Moore and Stratton, what they show is when interviewing a cohort of old widowers who are adjusting to their new life, they illustrate that through the interviews. Um, they talk about the expected roller coaster of men adjusting to widowhood, and which involves renegotiation of much of their day-to-day life and reconfiguration of their sense of self and relationships with family, friends, and others. But what they unexpectedly found was that widowers were quite resilient, and some were less resilient than others, but overall they were quite resilient. And the more resilient widowers, it was common among them that they consciously changed their lives. These men sought out companionship, which is similar to what Davidson had found earlier. One of the interviews that were interviewed, he made us interest clear in repartnering, including remarrying, saying that he'd be delighted to. Says, yes, I'd be delighted to. I mean, the trouble about being on your own is it doesn't matter how busy you are. At times you get very lonely. And certainly if the right person came along, I would only be too pleased to get married just like that. So there is resiliency as well. Old widowers who have limited social support and want companionship often enter a new relationship, and the intention to repartner might be related more to the men's weaker support ties. So, men that are well connected, have lots of family around them, lots of social ties. They're not that driven to repartner. Typically, men who don't have all those connections are more likely to repartner. Um, they might not be interested in remarrying. Um, as the author says, wives are not replaced. There's no replacement or substitution for a deceased spouse. In fact, the whole point is that the widower recognizes he is still tied to his deceased spouse, that he had expected to, continue his marriage. Unfortunately, it ends for him involuntarily. So his memory holds together the past and present. Some old men find companionship through dating. Sometimes they're in live apart together or lat relations. Um, so in Bennett, Arnott, and Soulsby 2013 analysis, they look at British widowers. Some of the old men report that they won't consider remarriage because of the deep feelings for their late wives. Others are uncertain about repartnering for a similar reason. A small percentage in the UK were actually interested in repartnering. Now, the author refers to stories that we hear about the widowed grandfather who locates his high school sweetheart on the internet, writes to her, and becomes, enters a living apart together relationship. And then, he talks about stories about the retired man with one ex-wife and a rebound cohabitant partner who again wants to be involved, and they meet over an internet-based dating site. Then there's stories about the gay husband who's now a widower and he's thoroughly put off by the gay dating scene, and he relies on coupled friends to kind of use their networks for him to get partnered. So there are many different kinds of situations of repartnering. Because of the greater acceptance of old men and women creating later life lifestyles, aging men who were once partnered, they have more options in their living arrangements and intimate relationships. Now they can live singly within networks of friends and close family, live solo, and they can date, or they can form a new couple relationship. Based on some national statistics in the US, amongst unmarried men, 27% of those aged 65 to 74 and 24% of them 75 to 85 were actually dating in the US. The old men who were dating compared to those who were not had greater economic and social capital. So there is a correlation of socioeconomic status and being willing to date again. And there's also a correlation of better health. So older men in better health who are more likely to have been divorced than widowed were also likely to date. Looking at single gay British men in their 50s and 60s, also they found that the primary factors encouraging the men's dating, it included their social climate and that supported privileged couple relationships and so on. Obviously, it's despite the statistics, the reasons for divorce often matter. Not all divorced men are happy to get back into a relationship. 4 in 10 US widowers who live alone just prefer dating relations based on companionship. And many of the widowers already had a lot of emotional closeness in relationships with friends. So among divorced and widowed old men in the US, more than 80% had not repartnered through cohabitation or remarriage during an 8-year period. It typically tended to be the younger men from 50 to 64 who had divorced who were more recoupled. It was important. The age was an important factor um, for the younger old people. And also, the reasons for divorce are quite important in whether the individual chose to recouple or not. So then the author looks at live apart together relationships in the US, Canada, and Sweden. So one of the things that's understudied is the lat relationships. 7% of aging men and women in the US are involved in lat relationships. In Canada, it's called common law, and it's same thing as a lat relationship. It's actually, the statistics are much higher in Canada. It's almost like 14-15% of aging men who are in lat relationships. In Sweden, about 1/3 of the men who identified as single were actually in lat relationships. One of the challenges, obviously, in lat relationships, it involves reconciling personal beliefs about the meaning of commitment and partner expectations. So there's a management of expectations. It also means coming to terms with the personal unimportance of marriage. So that's a readjustment of personal scripts on marriage. As one man viewed it, he says, I think relationships develop differently whether you're aged or whether you're young. So so it's all it's a lot of different expectations that people change and they expect to change. So there are several factors that influence repartnering decisions. It's the likelihood of later life repartnering. It's a lot about constraint as well. Now, whether an old man's later life is spent alone or coupled, it's influenced by his age, by his income advantage or disadvantage, his social capital, his health burden, and his own decision to repartner or not. In most advanced nations, there's a rising slope in the proportion of old men living alone. And it is the aging widowers and men with health disadvantages who heavily fall into this category. Another prevalent finding is that people later in life, particularly women, they tend to be reluctant to re-enter co-residential relationships because living together results in obviously less independence. It may signal future care work, and it may trigger serious tensions with existing family members regarding feelings of disloyalty. So a 62-year-old man talks about his experience of first cohabiting and then deciding to get into a lat relationship. My new partner and I tried sharing a household. Her daughter reacted very strongly. What's that guy doing in our house? And her son didn't say a word to me at breakfast, not even good morning or anything. That feels awful, not good. So I decided to move out and live separately again. Children adversely affect later life couples repartnering or living arrangement decisions in two ways. Adult children usually are a valued source of unspoken emotional support for aging men, and close relationships with their children may reduce or even eliminate old men's desire to recouple. Secondly, aging men may refrain from repartnering and living together because co-residence may threaten the quality of their intergenerational relations, such as alienating their kids and raising concerns with matters of inheritance. Typically, a new partner restructures the relationship chain so that the aging man's time and energy will be redirected to the new partner. Still, most often, adult children generally they appear to be supportive of their parents' new relationships. The caveat is as long as they did not plan to marry, the adult children seem to be fine. The adult children see the many personal benefits of parents repartnering. One 78-year-old woman noted that Peter's children, for example, think of all the work I've unburdened them from. Every time that he's ill, we went to the hospital the other day, they would have had to go with him instead. We ought to have a new collective moral code. Encourage your mother or father to find a new partner as soon as the former partner died. That's an interesting, different perspective. So for aging heterosexual and gay men who are not coupled, there is an underlying continuity to their relational selves as they transition with their partners into later life and very old age. And obviously, for men who end an intimate relationship in midlife or later, or who repartner, research shows that these men reorganize their social convoy. Okay, so again, what people do in their later lives in terms of repartnering is has a lot to do with their class, their social standing, and so on. And there's a lot of variability in that. That's pretty much the content of this chapter. Now, what we'll do is we are at 11:54. I actually finished ahead of time. That is absolutely wonderful. Sorry, I'm just feeling happy because the last 2 days have been unsuccessful in getting the material completed. Well, we'll take some questions, comments, and after that we'll adjourn for lunch, and we will meet up again at 3 p.m. to discuss the film in the context of what we've learned. Okay, looks like everybody's ready for lunch. Will you please schedule the breakout groups over lunch so that my group can meet to practice our presentation? Joan says this was very informative. Thank you, Joan. Yes, I can set the breakout rooms right away. What else do we need to do? Group 3, can we meet for a few minutes in the breakout room? All right, give me a few minutes. It takes me a few minutes to make them up just because, well, it just does. But yeah, so I'll set the breakout rooms right away and then we'll go from there. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4. Create rooms, we say manually. Okay. Okay, all participants have been invited to go to your respective rooms, so the rooms are open.
I have a question.
I think we'll give everybody a few minutes in case they got a slightly late start to the film. We don't have any more lecturing to do at this point. It's discussing aspects of the film itself in the context of several concepts we've covered, not just today, but over the last couple of days. We'll wait until 3:05 at the most, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll get started. The others will join us as they come in. Um, any thoughts? What do people think? What did people think about the film? Did you see some things that we could relate to with what we're talking about today, and what were the key themes that stuck out for different people? Go ahead, Akifa, and then Kendra.
Um, well, I noticed like age gap. Well, it started off with age gap relationships, but then it sort of ended off with like the ending sort of made it seem as if only people of the same age can understand each other, and that they're just like that. That's what I thought. Like I gathered from it that they're sort of like a different generation. But it did start off with like age gap relationships. Um,
But how can you relate it to, say, things we have learned today? For example, one expectation of, say, never-ending masculinities, or perhaps the almost the belief that maintaining, say, for example, erectile functionality being central to intimacy and to relationships, the need to, say, perhaps hide the fact that he was taking medicine for ED,
yeah.
all of those things. So can you?
Well, yeah. Well, Harry showed his like masculinity. I think first of all, even through not opening up about his emotions, he tried to avoid like getting into a relationship because he'd been like a bachelor his whole life. Also, when he went to the hospital, he was trying to hide the fact that he had taken Viagra until he found out it could be deadly to him. Um, that was sort of like the masculinity part that I gathered from that. I also saw like something like I noticed I don't know, like the difference in color that were portrayed in the film, um like Harry, I think his name was like um I think like he was like the dark side, whereas Erica was like light. She always wore like light colors, and like she noticed like those light rocks, whereas Harry picked up like the dark rocks, and he also always wore dark colors. um I don't know if that was like also some sort of like masculinity that he was trying to portray through that.
Um, I'm not sure that the rocks and stuff had a correlation. I didn't see it, but but thank you for your comments. I mean, that's definitely lots of things to see in the film. So I'm going to ask Kendra next to jump in and share her opinion.
Yes, hello. Some of the aspects that I was able to relate back to the content from the class was that the main character, Harry, or Jack Nicholson, he displayed, I noticed, never aging masculinities and by him continuing to do that and having to date younger women, he was, so that's one aspect. But then I also was able to kind of relate the hegemonic or like the traditional masculinity, right, of him having to portray being tough, and him not wanting to like disclose that he was taking medications, right, for his like erectile dysfunction. Those were some of the things that I was able to correlate.
And think about some of the models of masculinity. He's a never married old man, right? So I probably someone else can jump in and comment a little more about. There are many reasons why men remain never married, and we spoke about 4 different reasons. And he suggests a reason, and perhaps a little more light on that would be great. I think Chloe's up next. Thank you, Kendra.
I was actually just going to say similar to Kendra, like he kind of maintained this masculine persona, I guess. And it wasn't till the end that he kind of relaxed and realized and accepted his older age, I guess. With like the Viagra, he avoided it. He maintained these young relationships, and at the end he kind of accepted this, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. Like, I don't know,
So
just a level of acceptance at the end, I guess.
some more reconciliation with his lived embodiment of being a man, an aging man. Brian?
I just want to say I agree with Akifa, Chloe, and Kendra with all their point of views. I thought it was really insightful and unique. I just want to say, in terms of the movie, masculinity aside, if we were to look at the social relationship aspect, I found that we talked about how social relationships in both quantity and quality have long and short term impacts on our health, right? So with him, there's like three stages of his health where the first stage is he's kind of into younger women in terms of sexual pleasure. And that kind of impacted his health in a way that he had to take Viagra because of his age, right? But as he meets Erica, he kind of realizes he needs her in his life because you see in the movie, he experiences anxiety attacks and a whole bunch of other like mental stress and attacks after leaving from Erica. So I found that the social relationship in the movie is a main factor in terms of Harry's health, who he was surrounded by, and the relationships he had with them. And I don't know who it was who said this, but I think it was Chloe or Kendra. In terms of their life, Harry was a single person. He never married, right? And the reason
Right.
he never married was, well, he was not really into that kind of lifestyle. We talked about single old men, why they never married. And one of the things we discussed was they were never interested in permanence. They were never interested in like long-term relationship. They were only interested in temporary partnership. So that's one of the things I kind of associated with the movie. And in terms of Erica, she was in a long-term relationship and she divorced, right? After the divorce, I think she said she enjoyed her social isolation more than she preferred the company of her husband. And with Harry, I don't think he was ever divorced in the movie, right? So with Harry, it was more of it was like an empty shell, his life. He just preferred the temporary pleasures than something that was permanent. And I find that that's just because of the lifestyle he led. He was the owner of a record label, and naturally he would have the company of many young women around him. So that was kind of like impacted by his social relationships. And in terms of the whole sexuality and health thing, yeah, he had to pop Viagra. Yeah, he's old and he's got all these heart health issues like cardiovascular issues. I think that was just one of the things the movie kind of talked about in terms of men. Like as you age, you're gonna have all these conditions. You're gonna have to go through them. You're gonna have to accept and manage them. And Harry's way of managing them was, Viagra for his erectile dysfunction, blood tablets for his, blood pressure, to control his blood pressure and all that. And with his heart block, he had to go on long walks and to other medical exercises. So that's what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a movie is such a complex combination of themes, and it's almost like a three-dimensional cake, and you can take different sectors that portray different things. So lots of very interesting comments from all of you. So that's really, really good. I mean, it just reminded me of, first of all, him adopting the posture of starting out by adopting a never-aging masculinity kind of approach, and then didn't want to have the trappings of a relationship, and then slowly reconciling not just with his bodily change, but also with finding meaning in his life and his relationships. And that's why he talks about, trying to find closure for himself. He goes and tries to meet up with all of these women, younger women that he's dated for many, many years, and they kind of show that towards the end. So it's almost for him trying to make meaning of the way his masculinity has been shaped, and undergoing the masculinity script, undergoing conflict, and then him having to reconcile with all of that and accepting the change in habitus for himself, right? So that's one of the things I got out of it. Go
Can I
ahead,
also add on to
Akif.
what you said, Professor?
Yeah, okay, yes, go ahead, Brian.
I just want to say that masculinity reconstruction was also another thing I noticed, because he went from
Yeah,
the tough, well, not tough per se, but the closed off, cool kind of guy to the guy who wanted closure, like you said, right? And towards the end of the movie, you see his more matured masculinity where he's kind of up with his age. He's no longer going after younger women, and he's kind of sorting reconciliation, like you said. So I just wanted to say that he kind of reconstructed his masculinity, and he kind of went through this whole phase of rejection and had to rely on his new masculinity. That's all.
great. Thank you, Brian. Akifa next, and then Teresa.
I also noticed like the lat relationship, some like that, somewhat of that aspect, because he says somewhere along the lines of where he's used to just sleeping alone in his bed. So it seemed like, he was okay for that like temporary relationship, but not like living with someone. Like he wasn't opening up about that. So I noticed like there was some sort of like lat relationship, but then afterwards, towards the end, he opened up to.
I mean, he had a singular definition of intimacy, right? I
Yeah.
mean, according to him, there was just one definition, and then you went your own way, and you'd send the girls away, or you'd go to your own bed, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Tree?
I thought the drawer full of what do you call address books or telephone books of all the women that he slept with was a good sort of that was proof to him of his like he kept them because that was proof of his masculinity as he defined it.
Right, like a scorecard.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, they don't show more than that, but it definitely, there's no logical reason other than to actually have a record or a recollection of the many sexual adventures that he's had. Yeah, that's true. Anybody else? I guess. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the film. There are several things to observe. It is an entertaining film if you've not seen it before, and even if you have, it's every time I see it, there are different things that I interpret. So it's actually quite interesting. Obviously, feel free to talk about the film, but I'm also going to open up the discussion for tomorrow's presentations. I know some students have questions, concerns, anything that you might have. Just this might be a good time to talk about it before tomorrow, so everyone is at ease. Akifa, you have some concerns or questions?
Yeah, so basically, because we only have 4 people in our group, I just wanted to ask if it was okay that we took a bit more than 7 minutes, because I
So
know
it
you said
was
7 minutes per person.
right. So it would have been 42 minutes total, roughly 7, 6 or 42, a maximum time of 42 minutes. You can have 10 minutes each.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, looks like not too many concerns. Well, Evan, I got your email. It may be the same question, or is it a different question?
It was relatively the same question. It was a little bit of the opposite. I was wondering if I could mesh, since we all have about 2 sections each. I was wondering if I could mesh my 2 sections into about 7 minutes, as opposed to the 5 to 7 each.
Yeah. So so you want your presentation to be about 7 minutes? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
I want to know if I could keep it the same schedule. If you want me to
Yeah.
do.
No, that's fine. That's in an ideal situation. Everybody has the same amount of time, but with everyone having a different amount of content to present, if you are content with 7 minutes, that's fine, because it's going to be 7 minutes. We'll give 2 to 3 minutes for about 5 questions. Well, I'm going to restrict it to about 3 questions per presentation, because otherwise, we'll not be able to finish up tomorrow. So,
Okay, perfect.
yeah, so we'll do
All
that.
right, thank you.
No problem. Melissa?
I'm not exactly sure how to word this, but I was just wondering if the presentation is meant to, I guess, describe how, or I guess, like, are we presenting how, for example, ours is facing later life as an old widower. Are we trying to teach the class on the chapter and how the author is talking about these, like, and within the subtitles, so becoming a widower, bereavement, and stuff like that, how the author is portraying it? Or are we allowed to go beyond that and like use scholarly articles and teach or I guess what is a widower, and use scholarly articles and stuff like that? Or are you wanting us to keep it within the chapter and within the book?
So this question was asked before by another student, and my response remains the same, that there is a lot of content in your textbook itself, but that doesn't mean you can't go above and beyond. But at the bare minimum, you have to cover the concepts and the research that the author has presented.
Okay.
So that absolutely has to be covered. Anything extra you want to throw in there, go for it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Okay, I don't have any other questions. If you have any questions as to when your final mark will be out, typically all professors have 10 business days to hand in your final mark after the end of a course. So I think I'll get done much sooner. So sometime towards the end of next week, you should be able to see your final mark on D2L and then WebAdvisor. If it's not done by next Friday, then it will definitely be done sometime by early to middle of the week after, still keeping within those 10 business day deadline. So just so we get that out of the way and no one's worrying too much about the mark, the presentation mark is going to get posted pretty fast because that's something that I will be scoring instantly. Your assignments, even though I was very ambitious thinking I'd get to them, I mean, I simply haven't had time. So it's going to happen after the course is done for both assignments. All right. Well, if there are no questions, no concerns, then, well, thank you, Michelle. Kendra, you have a question? Brian, Kendra, then Brian.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question and then perhaps have you give some more clarity and another example. So regarding hegemonic masculinity, when we're talking about limitations, like would inclusivity be a limitation, right? Because it's not inclusive of other like older men that may, you know, like the same sex or various other demographic factors that would not include them in that, you know, like traditional masculinity.
So hegemonic masculinity is restrictive by its very construct. It favors some kinds of masculinities and some kinds of men, and it creates a structure where there are some men at the top and some men at the bottom and a whole bunch of men in between. And the rules of hegemonic masculinity favor some men to stay at a certain place in that continuum. So it's rigidly structured. So yes, it is exclusive or it excludes some kinds of men, definitely, whether it's gay men, whether it's men of color, whether it's trans men, and so on.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Brian?
For the presentation tomorrow, is it okay if we exceed just a little bit more than 2 slides? Like say if we have like 4 slides or 5?
You can have more slides. It was just like the number of slides is a guideline. The timeline is more or less strict. Now, I have allowed 10 minutes a person for groups of 4 because I recognize that each group will get about 40 to 45 minutes of talking time, and then there's question time. So typically each group will end up having little more than an hour in terms of not just their presentation, but the questions and the discussions that follow after. So keeping that in mind, the number of slides, I'm not going to be absolutely strict. That's just a guideline. Obviously, if you want to go with 4 slides, go for it.
We require any like references at the end, like work citations, bibliography?
No, I'm asking you to use the textbook to understand and explain the concepts and ideas. So I'm not going to
Okay.
require one. If you are going to refer to outside work, then yes, I want you to put the papers up on slide. But if you're not, then it doesn't matter.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Talking about the presentation, do we have to send you copies?
Michelle, can you speak up? I can barely hear you.
I said talking about the presentation, do we have to send you a copy or we just present it tomorrow?
Well, I will. You know what? I don't need a copy because everything is getting taped, so that should be fine.
Okay.
Everything is getting recorded, so I'm not too concerned about that.
Okay.
I just want to know, do I need to use a slide in order to do my presentation, or I'm just trying to do point form, because I am not good at doing computer stuff. So I'm just trying to do point form and to speak about it.
Well, you can, but there's going to be no visual for your presentation, and that might affect you. And unfortunately, our this day and age, we have to get comfortable with some form of presentation, whether it's Google Slides or PowerPoint or whatever. We're also limited by what we have for Zoom. So just listening to you speak without having additional aids, it depends. I mean, I guess if you could pull off a stunning presentation without visuals, I mean, I'm not going to complain. It is possible, but my sense is by not using an assistive technology, you might make it harder for yourself.
Oh my word.
Well, if your presentation is already ready, I mean, is there someone to assist you with PowerPoint, or can you put it in a Word document and talk about the pages? Is that possible for you?
Okay, I'm going to try and ask my daughter, so I see what I can get done.
Don't over stress. You're not going to master PowerPoint between today and tomorrow morning. So I'm not going to, I mean, it's a skill that you should have for university education. I think that's a good idea. But if you don't have it now, don't stress about it. You probably are comfortable with sending documents in Microsoft Word. You can put them out in bullet points there and talk about it as you share your screen. You can do that.
Okay.
Okay.
All righty. Thank you.
No problem. I guess Akifa is next.
Yeah, I had a question about assignment 3.
Yes.
Just in question 3, it says, what are the parallels between acceptance in aging and development of a chronic disease? Could you sort of just explain the question?
Yeah, so we spoke about this we used Melissa, who cited her example of of having a bulging disc in her back as to how the presence of a chronic condition makes or reminds constantly of the existence of the body. So a chronic condition reminds people of the body repeatedly, much like several factors in old age do. And that's the parallel.
All right. Okay, understood.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can't remember which lecture we spoke about that in, but
yeah, I think it was lecture 3.
Yeah, but just go through your chapters. It's one of them has it. I can. It'll take me more time to look at it and tell you. Hey, Melissa.
Thank you.
Hi, I was just gonna say for Joan, for PowerPoint, if her group would be okay with it. Like, I know for us, obviously we can't get together and stuff like that, and we're all going to be sharing our screens, but we're working on a PowerPoint, or you could do Google Slides. We're all working on the same PowerPoint document. We're not doing individual PowerPoint documents. So we're working on the same one. So if you could give them your information, if you're not comfortable with doing that, they can put your information onto a slide, and then send you back the PowerPoint, and you could just share your screen when you have the PowerPoint document.
Joan, did you understand what Melissa said?
Yes, I did. So I'm going to try and get everything done by tonight and then share it.
Just send it to your group, and they can probably put all the work together as one slide, or maybe if they don't want to do that, perhaps one of them can put it as, just make a couple of slides and send it back to you, something like that.
Okay.
Sorry, so I'm in Joan's group with her. And so far what we have done is we have it on a Google slide together. So it's just one big presentation that we can all hop on and work on together. So I'm positive that we can help out.
Okay, so Jenna, Joan, I mean, that's wonderful. If you guys can connect after and perhaps transfer information, and that would be perfect.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. You have wonderful classmates.
I just looked back, sorry, not in her group.
Oh, you're not in her group. Sorry, Joan.
Oh, so sorry, I mixed it up.
I was just thinking, I'm in Joan's group. I was like, have we done that?
Yeah,
we
no,
can't.
sorry.
Yeah, I was like, we didn't say anything about it, so how it came out, I was even surprised.
Yeah, so sorry.
No problem, Jenna. Perhaps Chloe, if Joan sent you her information, would you mind putting it on a slide so that Joan
Yeah,
can?
no, definitely. Yeah,
Okay,
I
wonderful.
can do that.
Thank you, Chloe.
Chloe.
No worries.
Good. It's always nice when things work out. Akifa, did you have your hand up for a question or a comment, or did you?
No, sorry, I forgot to lower it.
It's okay. It's all new to me. I show up in presentations and don't, I applaud for something that I shouldn't be applauding for, and I have my hand up and don't pay attention. So it's all good. I'll just ask again. That's all. All right. I don't see any more questions or concerns. So I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting then. Oh, thank you, Evan. And anything else? I can't guarantee you that I'll check my emails after 5 o'clock. But before that, if you have any concerns or anything, just send me an email. But I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, you all will be presenting tomorrow, relatively short presentations for each one of you. And we'll then see you all tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Okay.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Akif.